Chapter 61, The Journey. Thales watched with indifference as the nobles argued openly while throwing scathing remarks against each other in the dark. He lowered his head in dismal. He sighed lightly. Power, procedures, war, army force, the throne, is this the future I have to face? He suddenly felt that this unknown and strange world which had originally piqued his curiosity endlessly was becoming a little boring. Duke Cullen, who was beside Thales, stared at him in dissatisfaction. Cyril, do you have to be this straightforward every time? An earth-shattering roar rang from Star Plaza. It was noisy, and the noise was filled with both fury and passion. The sounds could not be heard clearly. On the other hand, in the Hall of Stars, members of the populace and nobles of the minor nobility class immediately erupted into a flood of protests. Shameless suzerain! This is a usurping of the throne. But we need an heir. What if something bad happens to the king at the front lines? Die, traitor! Jadestar is our king, that was our sacred pledge. This is all for Constellation. We must stand together and meet Exted head-on. The dukes quietly exchanged glares while the counts whispered among themselves. Silence! Silence! Gilbert tried his best to maintain order, but it was ineffective. That was until the Supreme King of Constellation, Kessel V, spotted a brilliant glint in his eyes. Grasping the mysterious scepter that shone with starlight, he rose from the throne and yelled furiously with his authoritative voice, "An heir?" The Hall of Stars immediately went silent. Everyone stared at the king's robust figure. What good timing! You just had to do this when Constellation is in trouble, and when all of us need to work together to fight the enemy. The king rested his hands on the scepter and watched Koster Nanchester with a sharp gaze. The one-eyed dragon slowly placed his hand in front of his chest and knelt on one knee before the king. Nanchester spoke steadily and seriously. The sincerity in his words could be felt. Forgive me, your majesty, but this is a test. I believe that the weakened and scattered powers of Constellation can once again come together amid this face-off between the dragon and Constellation. Everyone knows that the first person to speak out in forcing your majesty to appoint an heir will face the accusations of the masses. However, this is not so that Nanchester can take the throne. Koster raised his head, and the gaze in his one eye was clear. Your majesty, you can very well exclude Nanchester from the list of candidates. Everything is for Constellation's sake. Please appoint an heir, or at least set a method for the selection of the heir. That way, Constellation will definitely return to stand at the top of the Western Peninsula, and might even display the glory of the Empire again. Kessel slowly walked towards him and laughed coldly. Koster, sometimes even I cannot tell whether your awe-inspiring righteousness is out of sincerity or not. The one-eyed duke said calmly, but if it is beneficial for Constellation, does it matter whether it is sincere or not? I have also imagined this situation before. However, in my imagination, this would have happened during the Higher Parliament Conference. It did not have to be so ugly, Count Dagestan said as he steadily rose and went behind Koster. Similarly, he knelt on one knee. But your majesty, due to the national conference you decided to hold, this proper remonstration became a public conflict. One that appears as though we are publicly forcing you to abdicate your throne. Count Sorrel walked up from the back and knelt on one knee, speaking solemnly. However, we all have sufficiently legitimate reasons to resurrect this once mighty kingdom, which is right now in a disastrous state. Gilbert was so angry that his face was distorted in fury. Just by having a new king? Do you think that by wearing the crown, Constellation will become the Empire? Count Bosdorf walked forward gloomily and knelt down steadily. It is not that simple. Instead, we want to make the superior king who acts at his own will part of us. To think as we do and to act as we do. The ruler and the nobles were once united, and had been segregated due to the difference in power. Now, we will become one again. Zayan lowered his head and spoke sadly. The Covendir family has followed the Jadestar family since the Battle of Eradication. This vow will always stand. However, I think that Tormund I would also want to safeguard the safety and future of Constellation. He would understand. The Duke of Tricolor Iris Flowers rose with resolution and joined the kneeling group. Faken's inappropriate laughter rang at an inappropriate time again. Do you mean that we should adopt a king selection system? Ha, indeed, it will let all of you share the burden of Constellation. Just like Extet, is it not? Better than Extet. We have a 1,000-year foundation from the Empire. Count Lasha from South Coast Hill looked at Duke Zayen with a complicated expression. He then went forward and knelt. Cohen stared in disbelief as his father, the old Count Karabayan, quietly knelt along with Count Lasha. Kessel coldly looked down at these dukes and counts as one by one, they knelt down on one knee. Duke Cullen sighed at that moment. This is not the Jadestar royal family's fault. It is the fault of that crown, that throne, and that scepter. Since the royal blood is going extinct, for Constellation's sake, it might not be a bad thing if you appoint an heir. After Duke Cullen spoke, the two counts from the Eastern Sea, Javia and Almond, quietly went forward and knelt down. One of the members of the king's partisan, Count Godwin, spoke through clenched teeth. It is obviously a shameful act to force the king to abdicate his throne. How do you even make this sound so justified and righteous? Can you not see it? Derek Chroma steadily left his seat and knelt down. This is a representation of the general trend in the country. Below Renaissance Palace, the noises from the crowd became louder and louder. Bang! Val hit the handle of his stone chair with his fist. His gaze was cold. Clenching his fists tightly and lowering his head, he said, "Sometimes, I am really disgusted by all of you. An unbelievably coincidental war, an unbelievably coincidental remonstration, and the Northern Territory which is being sacrificed. Kessel V looked straight at him with a unique gaze that was difficult to comprehend. Under the king's indecipherable gaze, the Duke of the Northern Territory shut his eyes tightly and inhaled. His brows moved about, shifting as if they were a reflection of how great his emotions were in conflict with each other. In the end, as if having made a decision, he opened his eyes and looked at Kessel. However, Val did not look at the king's eyes. The heroic Duke of the Northern Territory spoke with desolation and disappointment, but if this can lead to the stability and safety of the Northern Territory and Constellation, Kel, maybe you should consider it. The two counts who were his subordinates from the Northern Territory lowered their heads in silence. Kessel's gaze dimmed. He turned and did not look at his good childhood friend anymore. Looking at how hesitant and guilty Val seemed, Duke Cyril Fakin has once again emitted a shrill laughter. Your Majesty, it seems like you only have two choices left, to immediately appoint an heir, or to set a king selection system. Kessel V stood above all his vassals without any facial expression. The only thing he grasped tightly in his hand was his scepter. Thales suddenly felt that his father looked very lonely. If he didn't find me, how would the situation today be? Watching everything by the side, Thales suddenly felt dizzy. It's coming again. A fragment of a past memory flashed before his eyes. Wu Qiren was sitting in an extremely small classroom, speaking to a lecturer in front of him and two other students. Paji inherited Weber's Deutsche academic tradition. With his research topic revolving around power, he investigated the formation of feudal countries. No. Not now. Thales pressed his palms against his temples hard and suppressed the flashback. When Thales' attention returned to the Hall of Stars, Kessel V's majestic voice rang beside his ears. It seems that if I do not appoint an heir, we will not even be able to go to war. Very well. Then, I shall appoint an heir. Zayan's brows furrowed slightly. He felt increasingly unsettled. Kessel V slowly sat down without even looking at the nobles on the floor. Those words that Thales had been waiting all this while finally resonated in the air. Let him meet everyone, Gilbert. It's time. Thales' mind went blank. He forced himself to gulp and watched as Gilbert waved his hand. Within the dark room, a secret door suddenly opened in front of Thales. It contained a long flight of stairs leading to an unknown location. The crowd in the Hall of Stars began discussing among themselves. The dukes and the counts maintained their composure. However, they could see the uncertainty in each other's gazes. Thales rearranged his bow tie, then addressed himself with the name that belonged to him in this world. Thales, it's time. Thales resolutely stepped on the stairs. Just take it as another game. One step. Another step. On the floor, Count Dagestan raised his head and stared straight at Kessel. I apologize for not understanding what you mean, Your Majesty. Could it be that the heir that you chose is not among the nobles in this hall? The Supreme King only stared at him coldly without saying anything. In the narrow passageway, Thales pressed his hands against his forehead hard. The flashback returned, but he clenched his teeth and firmly walked forwards. When he opened his eyes, he saw the Hall of Stars, but when he closed his eyes, he saw the other version of himself living within the fragments of those memories. The bond between the feudal king and his vassals is strongly emotional and personal in nature. Due to the fight for power, the bond slowly deteriorates. There is a breakdown in order, and the rapport becomes unstable. Violence and unrest breaks out periodically, then the unified feudal system finally falls apart. However, the rise of feudalism is still a praiseworthy effort in stabilizing public rule. Pachi also believed that in this process, the legitimacy of power, the boundary of the king's rule, the country's responsibilities and traditions, and even the importance of law became a part of history and received recognition. This is the most valuable legacy left behind by feudalism to the countries that came afterwards. But we still have to ask. What is lacking in Paji's observation and analysis? What is lacking? Your Majesty, have you chosen your heir? The one-eyed dragon, Koster Nanschister, raised his single eye and looked around him with a profound gaze. But it seems that the T-Bark family and the two distinguished families from the southwest have not arrived yet. The Supreme King still did not pay him any attention. Thales reached a side door and could already see the members of the populace gathered outside the Hall of Stars. No, it's not a side door. He realized that the door in front of him led towards the center of the hall, where the 20 stone chairs were. It's the main door. The guards had a solemn expression on their faces. However, some could not help but look at him and the emblem on his clothes. The moment they saw it clearly, the breathing quickened for many of them. Some even lost their composure and leaned forward to take a look. However, a guard who appeared to be the leader sternly reprimanded them to return to their positions. He then respectfully saluted Thales and cleared a path for him to enter the hall, but when Thales was about to start walking, "Go. You will be better than him." Thales raised his head abruptly. The guard had already turned and left. Only the back of a figure clad in armor and a helmet could be seen. Yodel. Thales clenched his fist tightly. Is it you? Similarly, some of the members of the populace gathered outside the hall had already noticed the boy standing outside the door. They started whispering among themselves while signaling to each other. The flashback faded away like a receding tide. The boy felt as though there was a newfound surge of energy in his body that made him more alert. Thales took 3 deep breaths. This is just another game, this is just another thesis defense. Thales pushed aside all his emotions and cleared all the expressions on his face. He then stepped onto the astral blue, patterned carpet. He stepped into his future. He walked onwards, passing by members of the populace who gathered at the outermost layer of the crowd. A squire from the outskirts dressed in slightly old-fashioned clothing jabbed his friend beside him, who ran errands between the city and the countryside. Who is that? Even a child can enter the Hall of Stars now? Maybe he's a noble. But he's so young. Can you see it? That child is dressed so beautifully. Almost as beautiful as the young lady from the Baron's family. Thales did not avert his gaze. He walked on, passing traders, artisans, farmers and the head of trades who occupied the steps. A plump carriage trader was a little surprised. He pulled the arms of two other people who were in the same trade as him. Look at that child. Is he a noble who came late? With that attire, he is definitely more than a noble of the minor nobility class. Do you recognize the emblem on his clothing? It seems a little familiar. I once fetched some customers, whose scrolls they held had that emblem. Why is he coming at this time? Thales did not stop walking. He continued onwards, then walked past the seats occupied by honorary militants and administrative officers. A judge from a little village nearby saw him. He furrowed his brows and lowered his head, whispering softly at the authorized signatory from another town hall. Look at that family emblem. That's, my God. How is this possible? I also think that it's impossible. Are you sure you didn't get it wrong? I have handled almost 100 warrants from the king. How can I get it wrong? Thales ignored them completely and continued onwards, walking past nobles of minor nobility classes such as lords and barons sitting on stone stools. The eyes of a baron smoking from a pipe shone with a bright light. He almost bit on the pipe in his mouth. He leaned his body forward and tapped his good friend's shoulder. That cannot be the 9-pointed star? What? This. Are you thinking the same thing I am? More or less. Then, now. Yes, as expected of the Iron Hand King. Thales paid them no attention. He passed by the stone chairs of viscounts, counts, and other nobles of the intermediate nobility class. An honorary count opened his mouth in disbelief. He did not have to notify the others as many of the nobles had seen Thales. Is that? Heavens above, this, how are they going to put an end to this? It cannot be. All these years, there was no news at all. Perhaps he is an illegitimate son who was wandering about out there. Then the suzerains. Hey, the waters in this matter run too deep. Let us just wait and see. The discussion, noise and chatter among the crowds became increasingly louder. In the end, it became a loud commotion. All the people stood up and leaned forward, eagerly watching the mysterious boy wearing a gold and silver 9-pointed star. Behind the stone chair at the center, Cohen turned his head curiously to look at the source of the commotion. A boy in noble attire who wore a 9-pointed star breastpin walked forward with a solemn expression. Seeing the 9-pointed star, the stunned Cohen did not move. That boy, why does he have the jade star family emblem? Without batting an eyelid, Thales stepped between the 13 stone chairs. Gilbert winked at him. The three dukes who were seated saw the approaching boy clearly. They could no longer maintain their composure. Val stared at the boy in shock and clenched his fists tightly. This, are you joking? Cullen furrowed his brows deeply and leaned his plump body forward. That boy, his emblem. On the other hand, Cyril ground his horrifying teeth and his brows twitched. He uttered a few words. This is indeed beyond my expectations. The Supreme King slowly raised his head. His gaze was cold but carried the hint of a smile as well. He chuckled as he said, everyone, meet Thales. The suzerains who were kneeling on the floor turned their heads. The moment Zayn Covendir, the guardian duke of South Coast, saw the boy's face clearly, his pupils immediately contracted. It's him, it's him. It's him. Kessel gently stroked his scepter once more, and spoke with dignified authority, he is my son. The only blood descendant of the Jade Star royal family. Thales extended his right hand forward and placed his left hand on his back. He bowed deeply to the king. He then turned towards all the suzerains. Good day, sirs, Thales heard himself say. That was the first time he spoke to the honorable suzerains of Constellation, who had a large number of troops in their hands, and ruled the kingdom. Chapter 62, You Owe Me a Word of Thanks. The suppressed commotion in the Hall of Stars officially became a hall-wide uproar. Everybody, including members of the populace, officials, and nobles of various classes, eagerly drew themselves forward. They all wanted to have a look at the first Jade Star offspring to appear in 12 years. Under Gilbert's orders, group after group of well-armed guards rapidly entered the scene and formed human barricades. Holding anti-force shields and riot control sticks borrowed from the police station, they forcibly warded off the crowd and maintained order. Move back, or else you will be punished for disrespect towards the royal family, the guards screamed at the top of their lungs. However, even these guards sometimes turned their heads back to look at that boy with the special identity but was only 6 or 7 years old. Thales stood in the hall unperturbed. Facing the gazes of people from the entire hall, he was calm and composed. This is what I have no choice but to face. He felt a little spiritless, which was why he felt extremely calm even though he had to endure an endless number of gazes trained on his person. Especially the gazes of those dukes and counts who numbered, altogether, more than 10 people. There was bewilderment, shock, fury, indignation, contemplation, and ambiguity in their gazes. After that, their gazes simultaneously became one of scrutiny and caution, piercing into him like sharp knives. There was also Zayn Covendir's complicated gaze. Zayen could only feel the blood in his entire body flow upwards to his brain. Trembling slightly, he slowly stood up and stared at Thales in disbelief. It's that boy, how can this be? The supposed illegitimate child of Lord Mon, him? The greater irony is the fact that I just saved his life from the hands of assassins yesterday. If I had insisted yesterday, or simply stayed out of it and let him die in the hands of the assassins. He clenched his fists tightly and gritted his teeth. No, we have not lost yet. There is still a chance. However, a greater, noisier, and more deafening cheer rang from Star Plaza. The news about the Jade Star descendant had finally been announced to the entire kingdom. Gilbert coldly said, "Go back to your seats, gentlemen. I believe that His Majesty will humbly accept your remonstrations and take your suggestions to appoint an heir. Why does this boy have the 9-pointed star? It has been 12 years, Your Majesty." Count Sorrel could not hide his shocked expression at all. He returned to his stone chair in a daze. We have never heard about Queen Kia having a third child. Who exactly is this unknown child? Count Dagestan muttered as he sat back down on his stone chair. He furrowed his brows in deep contemplation. Your Majesty, we still need an explanation. Duke Koster, the one-eyed dragon from Nanchester family, lowered his head. His expression could not be seen clearly in the shadows, but he kept his fists clenched tightly. He suddenly raised his head and glared furiously and fixedly at Kessel V with his single eye. To have a boy wearing the 9-pointed star family emblem appear at this time, are you toying with us? Kessel V did not even glance at him. He stared in another direction. Val furrowed his brows deeply and sighed softly. He spoke forlornly, Kel, I understand. So, this was your aim. Just like these disgusting people, you had a plan. You did not hold this national conference for the purpose of reacting to Extet at all, but for this child. The Duke of the Northern Territory leaned back and looked at the expressionless Thales. He then looked at the silent king and continued, do all of you think I am a fool? Ha, after all this, apart from the Northern Territory itself, nobody cares about Extet and the war. He laughed mockingly. Look, this is the glory of Constellation, the afterglow of the Empire. Kessel V ignored him. The other suzerains also avoided his gaze. The plump Duke Cullen furrowed his brows, a sight that was rarely seen. He contemplated earnestly in solemnity without saying anything. It is not a surprise. We are talking about the Jade Star royal family and the 19 noble families here. Duke Fakan has laughed dryly. Not caring that the people he reprimanded included himself, he mocked, the pillars of Constellation. Having calmed down, Zayen Kovendir exchanged a look with Koster. They tried to communicate with Duke Cullen, who was sitting in another stone chair. However, the latter had his head lowered in thought, as though nothing in the outside world mattered to him. Damned old man. The young Duke of the South Coast and the one-eyed Duke of the Land of Cliffs mentally scolded at the same time. He is the pioneer of New Star and also the first person to agree to the plan, but he is always the first one to retreat when accidents happen. Watching the counts and dukes as they returned to their seats, Gilbert responded coldly, everyone, you have heard what His Majesty has said. His Majesty will acknowledge this boy as his kin in today's national conference. The middle-aged noble took a step forward and tried his best to suppress his excitement. The Jade Star royal bloodline will hence continue. Wait. The Duke of the Land of Cliffs, Koster the One-Eyed Dragon, seemed to have just snapped out of the shock that made him lose his composure. He cut Gilbert off in a loud voice. We all know that 2 of His Majesty's children have, unfortunately, passed away 12 years ago, but we do not yet know what exactly this boy's origin is. Perhaps the effect would be minimal. However, this has to be stopped no matter what, or else, after planning for so long, they... Thales sighed and looked towards Koster. Are they those people Gilbert spoke about? Those who hope to rely on a sudden crisis to change the situation in the kingdom and, hence, obtain power and benefits? He glanced at Koster, Zayen, and the counts. Thales scrutinized them and shook his head slightly. This conference is practically like a farce in the market, but it determines the war and peace, and also the future of countless people in the kingdom. Who gave you the power to interrogate His Majesty about his son's identity in front of him during the national conference? Count Godwin, who was part of the king's partisan, demanded loudly in dissatisfaction. Having met Duke Zayen's gaze, Count Lasha slowly said, this is about the person who will inherit the throne and the future of Constellation. Every noble who had their title conferred by the king has the right to ask. How can we treat this as child's play? Fakan has clapped and let out a sinister and shrill laugh. Great. Just now, the Jade Star royal family was still an historical antique about to be swept into the garbage heap. Now, everyone is concerned about the future of the kingdom. Koster and Zayen cast a dissatisfied glance at Fakan at the same time. Val placed his hand on his forehead and spoke while suppressing his fury, let this damn farce end soon. No matter what the result is, the Northern Territory is still facing the threat of war. Although I know that all of you do not care, and even this crisis is just, whatever it is, just end it soon. By the end of his sentence, the Duke of the Northern Territory, whose gaze was full of fury, shook his head slightly. He said mockingly, whether it is the king or the suzerains, the Northern Territory should never have relied on any of you. The suzerains looked at each other and was silent for a moment. The noise in Star Plaza again became louder and resonated in the Hall of Stars. However, the reason is unknown this time. Kessel lightly tapped his scepter on the floor, garnering everyone's attention. The Iron Hand King's expression was calm and nonchalant. Thales, let everyone take a look at who you are. The king's tone was flat. However, his words made everyone's expression change all of a sudden. Sooner or later, they will kneel before you and pledge their loyalty to you. They will become your support and the kingdom's pillars. A few of the counts turned their heads without batting an eyelid, completely foregoing their intention to speak out. True. If this boy really becomes the supreme king of Constellation in the future. Without batting an eye, Zayan clasped his hands together and rapidly assessed the situation. If the higher parliament formed by the 19 nobles does not acknowledge this child's status, that way, even if it would damage our public trust, this damn national conference. Footsteps rang. Everyone sitting on the stone chairs turned their heads and watched as the boy went beside King Kessel. That seemingly thin, weak, and pitiful boy who had to endure the gazes of everyone in the hall. He maintained a calm expression, and even looked a little preoccupied. He sighed. I am Thales. Amid the noise, the neatly dressed boy spoke softly. The people in the hall quickly went silent so that they could hear him clearly. This was also a skill he learned from his past life while giving speeches. When speaking in a noisy occasion, the key to silencing others was not by speaking even louder than them, it was to leave them with no choice but to shut up so they can hear him clearly. I am a descendant of the Jade Star bloodline. My father is this kingdom's supreme king, King Kessel Jade Star. My grandfather is this kingdom's late king, the king of eternal rule, King 80 Jade Star. His gaze swept across all the suzerains in front of him. He saw the Duke of the Northern Territory, who sat alone at the side with a dreary expression. The Duke's head was lowered and he did not speak, Valorundi. And the two counts of the Northern Territory who were sitting behind him. He then looked at the aggressive one-eyed dragon, Nanchester, Zayan, who shook his head slightly while staring at him, Fakenhez, whose gaze was one of contemplation, and Duke Cullen, who had his head lowered and was smiling. He looked at the counts, whose expressions differed, but were similarly harboring ulterior motives in their minds. He even looked at Kessel V, who had an indifferent expression as he held his scepter. Thales suddenly awoke to reality. My status, the royal family's succession, and even the impending war and Constellation's safety. I'm afraid that those were never in these people's considerations. As for the casualties from the wars. The dispiritedness and boredom in the boy's heart became greater. By definition, he should talk about his origins in Mon Manor according to what he had been told to do, and then let the king and the people from the king's partisan do the rest. However, Thales felt a little worn out. He did not feel like following the script anymore, he had enough of all this. The boy's mind began turning. The formation of feudal kingdoms, the feudal king and his vassals, strongly emotional and personal, the struggle for power, the bond slowly changes. He then slowly opened his eyes and looked at the suzerains. The corner of his lips curled up. Consequently, everyone saw the boy shut his eyes, then opening them after a second and chuckling softly. Seeing Thales' sardonic grin and how he stopped speaking, Gilbert suddenly felt a chill running up his spine. Surely it could not be. Although this young gentleman often gave him plenty of scares, Gilbert would still prefer fewer surprises on such an important occasion. Thales blinked and slowly began speaking, I can prove that I am part of the Jade Star bloodline. But... forget about that. Thales swept his gaze across the nobles, who were watching him with greedy, predatory eyes. He quietly said, in any case, even if I am able to prove that I am a descendant of the Jade Star family, all of you will still have reasons to object to my inclusion into the family, right? Koster spoke coldly, child, do you know what you are talking about? If you cannot prove that you are the guardian duke of the land of cliffs, Koster Nanchester, Thales said coldly, are your intense objections for the sake of Constellation and the royal family, or for one of you to wear that crown? Is this not something everyone already knows? This is the national conference, and people from the entire capital city are observing this conference. Who do you think you can deceive with that righteous everything I do is for Constellation's sake air? The crowd in the hall immediately burst into uproar. Gilbert started to feel anxious. This was definitely not in the plan. He was about to speak, when Jins pulled him from behind. Jins gazed at Thales and spoke in a low voice, let him finish. He does not look like he is without a plan. Koster, who was sitting on his stone chair, glared fiercely at Thales with his single eye. However, Thales could feel that the Duke of the Land of Cliffs' breathing was quickening. Thales took huge strides towards Koster and stared fearlessly into his eye. You stepped into the Hall of Stars, saying that you want to aid the Northern Territory and unite the kingdom. However, as a prerequisite, you demanded for somebody among your own people to be appointed as heir to the kingdom, or else you will refuse to dispatch troops, and would rather see the Northern Territory fall into enemy hands. Of course, perhaps the decline of the Northern Territory is a good thing for all of you. Val, whose head was lowered all the while, raised his gaze and looked towards the boy. Koster was still staring fixedly at Thales with his single eye, like a mamba snake that was observing its prey before launching an attack. But Thales was not done speaking. His eyes burned, as if harboring the deepest fury. However, everyone knows that this is not righteousness but a deal. What you care about is not Constellation, the royal family, nor the people, just yourself. You are not a lone hero who is willing to be subject to disapproval for his kingdom's benefits. All you want is an heir of the kingdom who is to your liking. But you have to mask your desires and interests with righteousness. Thales coldly concluded his speech with the knowledge he had learned from the past 20 days. In the Far East, they call this masking your desire with excuses. Translated, it means this, one-eyed dragon, you are a hypocrite. And you disgust me. There was only coldness left in Koster's single eye. The suzerains stared at each other. They could see shock in the other's eyes. Although this is an undisclosed story every single intellectual knows, to speak about it in public is too. Wow. Fakeness clapped, as if he craved nothing short of kingdom-wide chaos. He grinned. At least you are pretty eloquent, child. Kessel V ran his hand gently over his scepter. His gaze was profound. After a few seconds, the crowd burst into an uproar. There were even people shouting loudly at the place where members of the populace and members of the minor nobility classes were seated. Are you done speaking? Gritting his teeth, Koshter suddenly stood up. He went right in front of Thales and looked down at him. He spoke intimidatingly, you damn child, do you think that by spouting nonsense, you can shift? Thales also raised his head all of a sudden and coldly cut him off, shut up, hypocrite. I am not done speaking yet. The Jadestar bloodline is standing right in front of you. I am the descendant of Tormund I, and my bloodline is one that you and your ancestors from every single generation had once kneeled and pledged your life and fealty to. Thales stared at the Duke of the Land of Cliffs without giving any impression of weakness. He spoke without regards for the Duke's feelings, even if you want to usurp the throne, for the sake of your ancestors, show me some respect. Koshter widened his one eye. He watched in disbelief as the child in front of him, only 6 or 7 years old, used the Jadestar status that even he himself had not obtained, to insult him. For a moment, he did not even remember to refute. A loud cheer once again rang from the plaza. Words such as Jadestar and Prince could be vaguely heard. Thales sneered and repeated mercilessly, oh no, it seems like the messages were already passed down, hypocritical Duke. Without waiting for Koshter's reaction, he turned abruptly and looked at the suzerains. Thales spoke steadily and loudly, all of you have made a deal in private, right? A group of nobles, with determining the next king as their goal, assassinated the ex-dead diplomat group and incited war. With the fall of the Northern Territory, some people will obtain territories and resources, some will receive promises and gains, and some. Thales slowly turned and looked towards the young Duke of South Coast. He spoke calmly, one word at a time, might get the crown. Right? Duke of Tricolor Iris Flowers? A lot of people turned their heads at the same time and followed Thales' gaze to look towards Duke Zayn Kovendir. Under the gazes of Thales and the crowd, Zayn felt extremely uncomfortable. The fact that he unintentionally saved and let go of the boy yesterday, resulting in the boy ruining the plan, also made him very angry. However, his strict upbringing, which had lasted for years, and his training as a noble, allowed him to hide his emotions and maintain the best demeanor. Zayn flashed a friendly smile and spoke steadily, child, making random guesses will not help you get your status confirmed. If you do not plan on explaining your origins and giving us proof, we will have to dispatch an investigation team and spend some time thoroughly investigating your past. Only then. Thales suddenly changed the topic and cut him off. Yesterday, on my way to Renaissance Palace, I encountered assassins. Thales watched all the seated suzerains as their gazes changed. He spoke calmly, it was thanks to you, the Guardian Duke of South Coast, Zayn Kovendir, helping me in the middle of your journey, that I was able to escape death. Gilbert and Jins looked at each other. They saw worry in each other's eyes. Hearing the news about the assassins, the crowd started whispering among themselves again. Thales nodded at him with a calm expression. A life was saved, but somebody did not say thank you. Zayn tried hard to suppress the anger in his heart. This brat. Is it because you know that I let go of such a large prey, that's why? That's why you deliberately came here to anger me? On the surface, Zayn smiled and nodded with considerable grace. You are welcome. Every noble who passed by had the obligation to extend a helping hand. Moreover, you already thanked me yesterday. However, even though you faced assassination, it cannot prove that you, but Thales did not let him continue. No, Sir Kovendir. Thales coldly raised his head. You misunderstood me. Thales walked, step after step, towards Zayn and slowly spoke, one single word at a time, according to his steps. That way, the words spoken will bring out the most oppressive and convincing air to others. I remember the moment when those assassins saw me very clearly. The leader was very shocked. He even shouted no. Thales went in front of Kovendir's stone chair and said slowly, Gilbert might have been wondering why I faced assassination, although my whereabouts had obviously not been leaked. Zayn stared in bewilderment at Thales standing before him. What on earth does he want to do? As the target of their assassination, I was also very astonished. At that time, almost nobody knew who I was. Even if I were promised that crown, if you, who had relevant interests to the crown, met me, you would not thrust your sword at me without giving me a chance to speak. Until just now, when I saw you and your accomplices pushing in unison for an heir to be appointed, I finally understood. Thales lowered his head and sighed deeply. They were not there to kill me, but to kill someone else. Zayn's expression finally changed. Watching Zayn's gaze that had turned from skepticism to shock, Thales slowly uttered his remaining words. Their target was another person who was also on his way to Renaissance Palace, and was bound to pass by that street. That person was also an important person who was also keeping a low profile and had come on this trip in secret with little protection. Zayn was so shocked that he could not speak. Thales' gaze was steady and his words were chilling. Looking at Zayn, who was sitting stunned in his chair, Thales cracked a smile. Yes, Duke Kovendir. Yesterday, I startled the assassins by passing through. At a corner where no one was paying attention to, Jins lowered her head and shut her eyes tightly. Your Grace, it was me. There were more than 10 professional assassins who had thorough planning, were well-trained, well-coordinated, and concealed themselves superbly. They had psionics among them, were equipped with military crossbows, and could accurately assassinate their target who was protected by supreme-class elites. It was me. Thales narrowed his grey eyes. Who saved your life from their hands? He uttered one final sentence, so, you are the one who owes me a word of thanks, Duke Coventir. Checkmate. Having understood something, Zayan's face became increasingly pale. He subconsciously rested his back on the stone chair. The two counts of South Coast Hill, Karabayan and Lasha, who were behind him, stared at each other in shock. Chapter 63, The Bloodline Ceremony. Thales had yet to finish his speech. Since you are the assassin's target, who could be the one who wants to take your life? Thales' voice pounded on Zayan's heart like a sledgehammer covered in iron thorns. Your Grace, let us take a moment to recall. What did you plan to do on that day? Who were you going to meet? Who would have knowledge of your whereabouts? Zayan exhaled deeply without giving away any emotion on his face, but the scene from that day kept emerging uncontrollably in his mind. He saw that Gilbert had been among those that were attacked, and to win Gilbert's favor, Zayan had lent a helping hand. Those assassins, that little boy, and also, the people who knew that he would be there. Thales sounded cold as he slowly replied word by word, was it those people whom you thought were your allies? Those people whom you worked hard with to achieve a better future for Constellation? Those people who once promised you a beautiful future? Thales turned his head around as he sighed. This makes sense. Did they also tell you that among those people who were qualified to succeed the throne, you're the youngest candidate with the best image, has the majority of the people's support, and is the most possible candidate? The silent crowd finally started to rise into a clamor. Everyone at the scene had different reactions towards Thales' behavior. Standing behind Count Karabayan, the young officer Cohen stared at the boy in astonishment. Is he really only 6 or 7 years old? When I was 7 years old, never mind, just forget it, lest I get upset over the comparison. But things did not always turn out how people wished them to be. The old Count Karabayan turned his head around and glanced at Cohen with a scrutinizing gaze before turning his gaze towards Thales. Under Cohen's increasingly bewildered expression, the old Count's gaze flickered numerous times between Cohen and Thales. Finally, the old Count sighed in disappointment after looking at Cohen, before turning his head once again to look at Thales. He left Cohen looking innocent and clueless, but Cohen then realized what the old Count's glances implied, so he lowered his head in misery. Old man, do you have to reach that extent? You can't just compare people like that. Morat, the Black Prophet, gently exhaled as he stared at Thales with eyes filled with mixed emotions. It seemed that he had previously underestimated him. The infamous chief of the Secret Intelligence Department whispered to Raphael, who stood behind him, this child was indeed out of our expectations. If he were the king you have to serve in the future, the advantage is that you will have less to worry about, but the downside is that you cannot possibly be worry-free. Raphael nodded gravely at the seemingly paradoxical speech. He understood what the prophet was trying to convey. Kessel V stared at his son with sparkling eyes. He turned his head slightly to the side, and murmured to Jins, who was by his side, did that child learn about eloquence and speech from Gilbert, or learn reasoning and observation skills from you? Neither. Jin stared at the center of the court, at that boy who was talking and explaining in such a serious manner. A bitter yet gratified smile appeared on her face. That child is rather unique. Rather unique. Kessel V pondered for a moment before he snorted lightly, his features clouded up with gloom and mixed emotions. You are right. He is just like his mother. Jin's expression froze. Kessel switched his gaze back onto Thales. Enough. Koster slammed against the arm of the stone chair furiously and cut off Thales' speech. He glared indignantly at Kessel's relishing gaze. Your Majesty, it is time for this farce to end. Our main point is Nanchester's one-eyed dragon. Why are you in such a hurry? Everyone turned around and, to their surprise, the person who spoke was the Duke of the Northern Territory. Val coldly raised his head. Why is it unfavorable for you if he continues his speech? Koster was left with his tongue tied. Val's eyes were raging flames. He turned his head around and stared at that haggard, horrible-looking man. Then, with words that contained an underlying meaning and were as sharp as blades, he said, as for you, Fakenhez, you old bones, under these circumstances, it was a wonder that you were not gloating over the misfortune, nor giving out sarcastic remarks. This is very uncommon of you. Thank you for reminding me. I was just about to start, haha. Cyril Fakenhez, who was slower to catch up than others, pointed his finger and guffawed at Zayan, who had an incredibly sour look on his face. But only for those who knew him the best could tell that his laughter was insipid. Seems that you have been made a fool by others, you immature young duke. Val stared at the plump duke across from him and said disdainfully, as for you, Duke Cullen, our prime minister, you are still as dependable as before. Duke Cullen smiled at the comment in an ingenuous manner. Zayan tightened his fist while maintaining what was left of his bearings, trying hard not to look at those people. If I'm dead, out of those people, who would benefit? He began to consider about the issues as he could not control the growing suspicion in his heart. Zayan tried his best to smile despite looking slightly pale for his complexion. He spoke weakly, enough, child. No matter what you say, there is still no evidence. Your Grace. Thales stared at this young duke, his eyes cold and distant as he purposely avoided the evidence that was just brought up. He deliberately coaxed the thoughts of both the duke and those who were listening to the direction he wanted. What position exactly did you have in the group that consists of people who care about the throne? Yes, this does not make any sense. You are not the only one in the group. Your group does not consist of just one person. If you were murdered, the rest of the group would feel unsafe and become paranoid. Then, the alliance would break by itself. Thales sighed again. Why would the person behind this have the intention to kill you, to carry out actions that would destroy the plan? Unless, there is a more terrifying possibility. Zayan closed his eyes and lowered his head slightly. He was not a fool. Thales moved around Zayan in a circle. With a sympathetic look on his face, he patted the shoulder of the iris flower's master. The possibility is that all the other members of the group knew that you are meant to be the sacrificial lamb. Your death is a part of the plan. You are the one who was betrayed, and the only one who was abandoned. This makes sense. You are young and promising. You have excellent skills and approaches towards matters. You came from a rich family and you have high popularity among the people. If you made your way up to the throne, even if it is just a throne you obtained by means of selecting a king, it will only take a few years for Covendir to become another Jadestar royal family who will begin to control and regulate the suzerains. Even if age is a factor, for your age, you will still live longer than any one of them. If that is the case, what would be the difference of them trying to change the royal family in the first place? If the tricolor iris flower's master was murdered in the capital, the nobles would become more terrified, the pressure for the war would increase, the blame that his majesty has to bear would increase, and the scheme in forcefully deciding an heir would perhaps become easier and smoother. The crown would also be worn by the person whom they favor more. Zayan's expression was indifferent, but everyone else could tell that his gaze had stopped moving for quite some time. Thales shook his head in a comical manner, as if he was an adult. Before you have the chance to wear that crown, you have already been betrayed. It all boils down to the fact that you are still far too young and careless in befriending others. Thales walked back to Kessel's side, and coldly continued, they probably borrowed a great amount from you and the Covendir family's power, and have been making preparations for a very long time. But no matter what they promised you, they will not fulfill that promise. Please think about it carefully, and then reconsider your stance. You are a wise person, which side are you more likely to choose as your ally? Who would provide the greatest benefit towards Iris Flower's growth as the king? Zayan kept his glance away from Thales while remaining silent. He stared fixedly at the floor beneath him, as if he was interested in the pattern of the floor tiles. At this moment, Thales suddenly snapped his head around. He cried in a strange manner at the suzerains on the stone seats, do not move. Many of the suzerains furrowed their brows. Thales carefully swept his gaze over everyone's faces, as if he was inspecting them down to their every pore. He coldly said, do not move. Those who betrayed Zayan, do not turn your heads or move away your gaze. Look into my eyes, I can sense your guilt and fear from your expressions. Zayan raised his head abruptly and stared at the suzerains. Some of their breaths stopped during that instance. But the next moment, Thales' whole frame became loose as he relaxed. He opened his palms and giggled, you do not have to be nervous. I was only kidding. Some of the suzerains released the breath they were holding. They clenched their teeth and balled up their fists tightly as they glared at Thales. Did he do that on purpose? Thales looked at the suzerains as his expression became solemn once more. But after seeing Iris Flower's example, you should understand that once Jadestar has no heir, regardless of which other clan or distinguished family succeeds the throne, no matter if it is before or after the ascension, no matter for whether they are weak or strong, the new royal family will eventually become the next target of the suzerains. Without any external forces from other enemies, you will begin fighting against each other over the uneven distribution of power until the fall of Constellation itself. I do not care who the one that formed the conspiracy plan is, nor do I care about who is the one that wants the throne. Since, for most of you, it is a conclusion set in stone that the royal family has no heir, and naturally, you would want to choose the future that is most beneficial for yourself. However, I am already standing here. For the peace and stability of Constellation, and also for your own benefit. The succession of the Jadestar royal family is the biggest hope for Constellation's stability. Everyone, for everything, please be like your ancestors and support Jadestar firmly and unwaveringly. Please support me. The crowd's discussion became increasingly louder, and some people began to applaud. Coincidentally, the hurrah from the plaza also came through tier by tier. It was unknown which sentence exactly the guards had passed from inside the hall. Thales did not look at the suzerains' expressions. In fact, he enjoyed it even more to imagine their expressions. Gilbert finally let out a long exhale and whispered to Thales, who was walking back to him, that certainly left a great impression on the people, my young sir. Gilbert lowered his head and whispered his question, the threat brought on by Iris Flowers has already disappeared amid his own suspicions and doubts. The great Deer Antler's power and influence also decreased greatly, but how are you certain that those assassins were targeting Iris Flowers? Of course I am not sure. Thales flashed him a smile, and with a bright glint in his eyes, he stared at Zayan, who had his head lowered in pensive silence and had yet to speak up. But he also has no knowledge on that, does he? You have to grasp the main point in everything you do. What really matters is not the assassins, but rather, the fact that Zayan saw those assassins with his own eyes. Thales could feel Kessel V's serious gaze on him. He tried to maintain his normal breathing under the considerable stress, and said with a relaxed tone, it's just like what happened just now, what really mattered was not the possible recognition of my identity, but about the people who were unwilling to acknowledge my identity. I still have one more thing to say. Even though it was emotionally satisfying, the behavior you demonstrated just now was not the most brilliant political move. Under Thales' puzzled gaze, Gilbert released a long sigh and whispered, you will understand this later. Stop the nonsense right now. This is utterly futile and useless. The raging one-eyed dragon, Duke Nanchester, slammed against the stone seat hard and swept his gaze over the crowd with a menacing and oppressing glare. Did everyone forget? Until now, he has yet to prove his own identity. His Majesty did not have any sons for a whole 12 years, then all of a sudden, a child of 6 or 7 years of age suddenly jumps out and claims that he is the descendant of the royal family? And he even gave wild statements and speeches at this national conference. Thales sighed and cut him off loudly by saying, Duke Coster-Nanchester, why are you still dwelling over my identity? Do you still not understand? My father had prepared for this a long time ago. Thales tilted his head slightly and gave a pure smile. I thought hypocrites like you, who worry about the nation and the people on the surface, should be elated over the return of Jadestar's blood. An inauspicious feeling rose in One-Eyed Dragon's heart. At this moment, the crowd once again burst into uproar. Someone new was stepping into the Hall of Stars. Thales turned his head around and his eyes immediately lit up. A beautiful woman with an elegant demeanor, dressed in a dark, ceremonial robe with an image of half a red sun woven onto it, slowly walked across the lane which was forcefully separated by the royal guards, and accompanied by a nervous young priestess. Many of the commoners kneeled down devoutly and prayed towards the woman with their heads lowered. Many of the nobles already understood something the moment they noticed that half red sun. Very good. Faken has narrowed his eyes. King, nobles, and also gods, all three main pillars of constellation are here. The pupils of the Duke of the Northern Territory narrowed in response at the very moment he saw the newcomer, and his body moved forward uncontrollably. Starting from this very moment, be careful with your words and behaviors. Count Karabayan solemnly turned his head towards his wife and nephew. Count Derek Chroma, who was just as surprised, whispered, things have already gotten out of hand for the suzerains. I am afraid that the gods have also participated in this. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the human spokesperson of the Sunset Goddess, the head ritual master of the Sunset Temple, Licia Arundi, gracefully stepped onto the stone seats region. Licia. Val Arundi was stunned. His originally desolate expression turned complicated when he saw his little sister. It has been so many years. But the head ritual master did not spare one glance at her own brother as she kept walking forward slowly. Koster looked appalled. He wanted to exchange a glance with Zayn like how they usually would, but he discovered that Zayn was cold and callous, without giving him a single look. The one-eyed dragon's heart became bitter and astringent. Kessel V stood up solemnly. Head ritual master, Licia. The spokesperson of the Sunset Temple and the Sunset Goddess. The authority from the king, the oath from the nobles, and the witness from the gods, these are the three most important testimonials, concurrent to when Constellation was founded. After over 600 years, today, please let the Sunset Goddess witness the continuation of Constellation's royal bloodline as before. The whole hall burst into uproar once more. The expressionless Licia bowed down and nodded her head slightly. But she did not immediately reply. Instead, she kneeled down on the ground with her head facing the sky and closed her eyes. Thales stared curiously at this head ritual master who did not really like him. Is she communicating with the gods now? But suddenly, Thales felt an indescribable feeling in his heart which caused him to feel very awful and unwell. A noise that was similar to ringing suddenly went off. Beep. He was horrifically frightened. As he forcefully held back the desire to cover his ears with his hands, he surveyed his surroundings. Everyone in the hall, regardless of nobles or commoners, did not make a sound, nor did they show any sign of intolerance. Could it be? When that ringing noise disappeared, everyone around him was normal. Could he be the only one who heard the ringing noise? All this time, the boy did not know what the gods in this world truly were. But now, another question was added to Thales' heart. After a while, Licia gently opened her eyes as she stood up and said, the goddess has responded, Your Majesty. Duke Cullen sighed. He already knew the conclusion of the matter. Koster clenched his fists tightly as his eyes glinted like frost and snow. Faken has laughed drily. Zayn, on the other hand, was thoughtfully looking at Thales, who was the focus of the hall. Kessel V gently nodded his head. He suddenly grabbed Thales' hand, and his abrupt move frightened the boy. Come with me, Kessel said firmly and unquestionably, everyone of Constellation should see your blood. Thales let Kessel V hold him. With his eyes fixed and his mouth wide open in shock, they walked towards the balcony overseeing the Star Plaza from the round stage consisting of the stone seats. Truthfully, he had yet to become accustomed to this. Maybe it was because, from the bottom of his heart, he still had not regarded this strong man as his father? The 19 noble suzerains stood up from their stone seats and followed the king and his son to the spacious balcony. Many of the surrounding intermediate or minor nobles wanted to follow, but were relentlessly held back by royal guards' erosion shields. Thales walked to the edge of the balcony and looked downwards. It was afternoon, and the weather was just right. He then held his breath immediately. People. There were so many people. A thick swarm of them. The entire Star Plaza was full of people. There were at least a few tens upon thousands of them. They took up the entire lower half of his vision like ants covering the entire ground. It was not the first time Thales had been to the Star Plaza. He had also once stood on the Star Plaza looking up at the magnificent Renaissance Palace. But he had never before stood in the Hall of Stars balcony inside of Renaissance Palace and looked down at the entire Star Plaza. Even though Thales had two different sets of memories belonging to two different lives, he still could not help but gape at the scene. Soon, the crowd on the plaza vaguely noticed that there were two more people on the balcony. Once they confirmed that the two people were the king and his kin, an unprecedented, earth-shattering hurrah was heard from the crowd on the plaza. King. King. Long live Jadestar. Constellation. Constellation. Kessel was still gripping Thales' hand as he slowly said, Do you see? These are our subjects, our burden, and our responsibility. The Almighty King asked meaningfully, are you ready to live for Constellation? Without waiting for Thales' reply, Lycia walked towards them with a cold look on her face. The young priestess with her seemed very nervous. She was trembling as she held out a platter with a rare and precious dagger on it under Lycia's signal. The Bloodline ceremony? Duke Cullen walked towards the balcony with the help of his 2 attendants and shook his head. It has been almost 200 years since the ritual was used. Prince Kara's Bloodline recognition ceremony, when was the last time it was carried out? No one answered him. The Duke of the Northern Territory stared at his little sister, whom he had not seen for many years, in a daze. However, Lycia did not spare him a single glance. The elegant and graceful head ritual master slowly walked to the spot in between the king and Thales. Under the watchful eyes of the entire plaza, Kessel gently picked up the dagger and sliced open his left forefinger, then he put the dagger back on the platter. The priestess held the platter out to Thales. She was only 11 or 12 years old, but it appeared that this was her first time being in such a situation, where she was watched attentively by thousands of people. She trembled nervously. You do not have to be nervous, everything is fine. Thales smiled at her as he picked up the dagger with the symbol of a red sun engraved upon it and sliced open his left palm. Without any emotions on her face, Lycia extended her hands to hold both the king and Thales. She then lifted her head. It was totally different from the type of long and tedious praying ceremony which Thales anticipated, because at the very next moment, the exact same blaring light, from when Lycia and Thales were in the stone room, exploded out from Lycia's eyes. The people from both the balcony and behind the balcony who were fighting to watch the event fell into a sudden silence. Many of the commoners started to kneel down as they prayed with their eyes closed from the bright light from the middle of the balcony. The brilliant rays became brighter and brighter. Even the people in the plaza, under broad daylight, could begin to clearly see what was happening on the balcony. The people in the plaza were mostly commoners who had no right to enter the Hall of Stars. Almost everyone in the plaza knelt down devoutly and prayed in the direction of Renaissance Palace above their heads. The kneeling of the believers made the whole Star Plaza appear as if a tidal wave was surging forward from the Hall of Stars balcony. But Thales did not have the energy to focus on this amazing view. The boy discovered, to his surprise, that the blood from both his and Kessel's palms were floating within the bright ray from the head ritual master's eyes. And then it combined into a single red ray of light. This is... Thales stared at that light in puzzlement. An accident happened in that very moment. Chapter 64, Put to Vote Beep. Thales heard the strange ringing in his ears again. This time, Thales lowered his head in pain, his face contorted. Compared to just now, the ringing in his ears this time was especially loud. It was almost as loud as the magic sound from the psionic assassin yesterday. What on earth is this? Thales endured the pain as he knew that he could not make any mistakes at this time. All the people from the capital city were witnessing this moment. Lycia's glowing eyes looked towards him in puzzlement. The light became increasingly brighter. It was so jarring that all the people on the balcony raised their hands or turned their heads away. Even the 5 dukes, who stood the closest, could not see clearly nor hear the things happening at the center. Under the bright light, Thales was also slowly becoming unable to see the situation outside clearly. Amid the painful ringing in his ears, Thales could barely see Lycia and Kessel's silhouette. He was starting to grit his teeth, enduring the torment of this ringing in his ears. The boy's abnormality was subsequently noticed. Lycia's eyes, which were shining with bright light, closed and opened. She then asked in bewilderment, "You? Why are you? What is going on?" Thales felt inexplicably anxious. At that moment, Thales could clearly see King Kessel's robust figure. Amid the light, the king suddenly turned his head. "Lycia," the king spoke softly. Only Lycia and Thales, who were the nearest to him, could hear it. For some reason, Kessel V was not authoritative and cold like usual. This time, his tone was a pleading and helpless one. The dignified Supreme King of Constellation pleaded in a soft and submissive tone, "Please. This is the future of Constellation, and also my dear's long-cherished wish." For some reason, Lycia's hands that were holding on to both their hands trembled slightly. However, she then turned her head and looked towards the king. Lycia asked in disbelief, It's her? But the king did not answer her. The next moment, the light disappeared. The ringing in Thales' ears also disappeared. Finally free from the ringing in his ears, Thales sighed in relief. He took huge, deep breaths. What on earth is going on? The ringing in my ears, the head ritual master's suspicion, the king's pleading. He recovered from his stupor and the people on the balcony returned to his vision. The only thing remaining in the air was a streak of red light which connected Thales and Kessel's wounds. After being under everyone's astonished, delighted, disappointed, and complicated gazes for over 10 seconds, that streak of red light finally disappeared too. Lycia's expression at the moment was one of extreme fatigue. She raised her head and gave Kessel a profound glance. Kessel V did not speak. He calmly endured her gaze. Lycia glanced at Thales again. This time, without mistake, Thales saw surprise, disgust, and fear in her eyes. The nobles around them were holding their breaths as they watched everything. Thales knew that it was not the right occasion. He could only grit his teeth and bury his qualms, along with the pain of that ringing in his ears, in his heart. Just like what he did to the other countless number of mysteries. The head ritual master of Sunset Temple turned her head and gave Kessel a complicated and pain-filled glance before she feebly announced, "The goddess has decreed that these two are father and son." Their blood is related, and their fates are interlocked. Having said that, the head ritual master left decisively by the side of the hall. Amid the people in the crowd, who were worshipping her on bended knee, she left the balcony. She did not glance at anyone nor at anything in the hall, without any hint of attachment to the people in there. Only the silent Kessel and the shocked Thales were left there. The child priestess anxiously glanced at the two of them before hurriedly picking up the salver and leaving, too. The next moment, a cheer erupted in the Hall of Stars which had been silent because of the Bloodline ceremony. Under Gilbert's prompting, the guards passed the messages to the plaza. After 12 years, the Jade Star royal family finally had a new member. The commotion on the balcony soon turned into one that affected the entire plaza, a revelry that affected tens upon thousands of people. Jade Star dash. The cheers were almost reverberating through the vaults of heaven. The expressions of Koster and the few counts became one of defeat. Gilbert and those from the king's partisan excitedly exchanged glances. Jins was the only one whose gaze also carried obscure and complicated emotions apart from delight as she watched Lycia's back. The plump duke exhaled, his expression was filled with delight. Alright, since the Sunset Temple has acknowledged this child's bloodline, I believe that he is indeed, unmistakably, His Majesty's blood descendant. Koster, who was beside him, stared at Duke Cullen coldly. What a sly old fox, he changed sides so rapidly. According to the Holy Constitution of Constellation, after the royal family and Sunset Temple both acknowledge his status, the next procedure would be for Constellation's higher parliament, which is comprised of us, the 19 nobles, to acknowledge his status, to acknowledge that this child is a prince of Constellation, Duke Cullen said with a smile as he stood on the balcony, with the cheers from the plaza serving as background noise. Wait. Koster gritted his teeth and said the following words, I remember that no matter who this child's mother is, it is not Queen Kia? The expressions of many of the nobles present immediately changed. Gilbert's expression also immediately became unpleasant. Kessel V turned his head and looked towards Koster. The mayor of Steep Forest City and the Duke of the Land of Cliffs, Koster Nanchester, exhaled. This child is His Majesty's illegitimate son. Thales clenched his fists tightly. As expected, my status. Count Dagestan was the first one to react. Yes. According to the Constitution of Constellation, an illegitimate son does not have the right of succession. The conversation on the balcony could not be heard clearly in the hall. However, the nobles sitting at the front who were the closest to the balcony were passing down the conversation. Hence, the entire Hall of Stars still burst into an uproar. Tormund I was also an illegitimate son. Gilbert's eyes were blazing. And he is the king of Renaissance that all your ancestors pledged their loyalty to. Tormund I's mightiness is not due to the imperial blood from the empire flowing in him. He built Constellation through personal struggles, countless conquests, and bloodbaths. It was the same with our ancestors. Do not forget that 600 years ago, many of them were their family's illegitimate sons, sons of extended families, or frustrated knights. They worked for their status with their hands, Count Sorrel, whose territory was within the Land of Cliffs, added to what the Duke of the Land of Cliffs said. Is this illegitimate son 5 or 6 years old? What has he done to deserve the right to inherit this great kingdom left behind by Tormund I, like a son born from wedlock, without being constrained by his status as an illegitimate son? The one-eyed dragon's gaze was chilling. Your Majesty, of course we should acknowledge him as your son, and as a blood descendant of Jade Star. This is the goddess will. However, if you want to acknowledge that he is a prince with the right to succession, an illegitimate son as our next king, at least I will not be bending my knees and pledging myself to him. The Duke of the Northern Territory watched the one-eyed dragon, there was sadness and resignation in his gaze. You just refuse to give up. Right, Koster? Even if it is for Constellation, for the impending war? Koster deliberately avoided Val's gaze. He only stared at Kessel V. The shady Duke Faken gave a hollow laugh and said, of course he will not give up. He has become arch-enemies with this child, hasn't he? Thales' heart skipped a beat. He suddenly understood what Gilbert meant just now by telling him that he did not make a brilliant political move. He had angrily denounced Nanchester and lured out the secret organization just now. He then targeted Covendir. This act removed the tricolor iris flowers from the list of enemies and planted the seeds of doubt in him. However, it also thoroughly made the Land of Cliffs Koster Nanchester, the Great Deer Antler, his arch-enemy. It can be said that Koster Nanchester's initial aim was to strive for the greatest gains on behalf of the organization of nobles, in face of the royal family that was doomed to be heirless. But now, the Great Deer Antler's aim changed into not letting Thales inherit the kingdom. This was for the sake of the Great Deer Antler's future survival. Had he, after all, been too impulsive just now? Thales discreetly clenched his fist. You all saw that. The child has a dark personality and is not of a generous disposition. He is unsettled and disturbed over the fact that he encountered assassination, and harbors doubt towards all of us. The one-eyed dragon took a step forward on the balcony. Although his voice was low, the words he said were bone-chilling, that is why, out of nowhere, he made up the alleged conspiracy about us planning to usurp the throne. Do you think he will easily let go of you all, the ones he once suspected to be the manipulators of the things he experienced, once he takes the throne? The suzerains furrowed their brows simultaneously. A few watching Thales in contemplation. Koster continued with his criticisms, there is only one virtuous king in Constellation's history. And that is Prince My Dear, whom all of you have met, and who was kind-hearted, fair of mind, and tolerant. Kessel furrowed his brows deeply. Whether you participated in his fabricated organization or not, you all are already on his blacklist. Many years later, after he takes the throne, are you certain that he would remember today, and remember you all? Humph, the ruin of Constellation? Only when a day comes when all the nobles feel that they are in danger, then that would be true ruin. Gilbert gritted his teeth. Koster had grasped onto the thing that the nobles were most afraid of. Kessel V lowered his head and glanced at the pale-stricken Thales. Even if it was for the sake of Constellation's future instability, Your Majesty, are you sure that choosing such an heir will not push Constellation towards the abyss of fragmentation and ruin? The other counts looked at each other and did not say anything. They contemplated Koster's words until one of them broke the silence. Count d'Agistan coughed and spoke with his brows furrowed. Yes. Going back to the main topic, I, too, feel that right now, having an illegitimate son of low status as the Supreme King of Constellations is not very appropriate. Even though the royal family and the temple have already made their decisions, we, the higher parliament, should still be more careful. He looked at Thales, who had not yet recovered from the aftershock of the Bloodline ceremony. However, his gaze was no longer rude and scrutinizing. Instead, it was prudent and careful. Kessel V knocked his scepter on the floor and spoke calmly. It seems that it is indeed difficult for all suzerains to reach a common outlook, is it not? Then, let us take the final step. The members of the higher parliament can decide their stance towards this child through voting. Thales exhaled deeply. So, in the end, I still could not hold my fate in my own hands? The Supreme King looked towards the side at Duke Cullen, who was being supported by someone. Duke Cullen sighed and nodded slightly. The vassals from Blade Edge Hill are not present, reducing the total number of votes by 3. However, the remaining 5 Guardian Dukes and 11 Counts, amounting 16 high-level vassals, still have the right to make this decision. The plump Duke widened his eyes slightly. Gentlemen, should this child be a prince of Constellation who has the right to succession? Jins, who was standing behind the king, could not hold it in anymore. She furiously bellowed, Hey! Why does a prince of the royal family have to be acknowledged by the higher parliament? The dukes and the counts ignored her. Only Koster snorted softly. The one-eyed dragon said in a derisive tone, This is men's business. Ladies, please remain silent. Because this child is involved with the right to succeed the throne, this is a pledge from the day Constellation was founded, the old Count Karabayan said at this moment, and relieved Jin's embarrassment. He sighed softly and continued, The king and the suzerains ruled the kingdom together in the hopes that dictators such as those in the era of the empire never appear again. Duke Cullen glanced at Thales. According to the rules Mindes III said 150 years ago, as long as the votes tally over half, it will be effective. If the votes are less than half or exactly half, this child would be an illegitimate son who only has the right to inherit assets. The voting begins. Chapter 65, Lay in a T-Bark. Nay. Koster shouted loudly, Those who want to see an utterly chaotic constellation, feel free to vote aye. Nay. Nay. Both Sorrel of the Land of Cliffs region and Count d'Agistan followed. Valarundi furrowed his brows and said, I do not know what this will bring to the war ahead. Koster solemnly said, Sir Val, the entire Land of Cliffs military will step forward, and the promise to support the Northern Territory is still in effect. The Land of Cliffs adjoins the Northern Territory, it would never stand by helplessly and let its friends succumb to the flames of war. You know, we are the closest and we are more effective than the royal family in providing military forces to help. But I am very worried that the future of Constellation could be ruined in the hands of this illegitimate child whom all of the vassals are wary of, and is also wary of all the vassals himself. Koster's single eye stared intently at Val, his expression was serious. Val fell into silence for a very long time before he finally sighed. This warrior suzerain who seemed to be made out of iron, desolately said, This is for the Northern Territory and for Arundi. Unnoticed by the others, Kessel V grasped his scepter even tighter than before. Nay, the Duke of the Northern Territory voiced despondently. Count Zamunto and Count Fries also deeply sighed. Nay. Nay. 6 people have opposed, Duke Cullen said expressionlessly. Jin stared in disbelief at the Duke of the Northern Territory. Thales, on the other hand, weakly shut his eyes. Count Talon. Koster faintly said to the 5-pointed stars Count Bern Talon, who was among the 16 people there. I know your dominion is just near the Central Territory and you have a good relationship with the royal family, us dukes are indeed unsuited to succeed the throne. But you are different. The 5-pointed star is the branch of the 9-pointed star. Koster raised his hand, his speech was bewitching. If the king does not have an appointed heir, I believe you would be on the list of candidates. Everyone's gaze turned towards Count Talon. Bern Talon was drenched in cold sweat. He looked towards Kessel V, but the latter just stared coldly back at him. Of course, as a powerful competitor for the throne, could this child think that you are a part of those evil schemes as well? Koster asked with a smile. Thales started to feel anxious. He was just about to speak up before the king held him back. Kessel V closed his eyes and spoke with a dignified voice, Bern, just follow your heart. After all, the 5-pointed star is not a 9-pointed star. Bern Talon was hesitant. He took a deep breath before he finally hung his head dispiritedly and said, The Talon family will forfeit. Many of the suzerains furrowed their brows again. Koster smiled without saying another word. The Talon of the 5-pointed star was the only one out of the 13 distinguished families who was conferred the title of Count, and was not located around the 6 great clans' territory. They were neighbors to the royal family's central territory, and they had always been Jadestar's biggest and strongest supporter. But now, they... At this very moment, a voice could be heard. I. Everyone turned in astonishment, only to find the person who voiced up to be Zayn Kovendir. He had remained silent for a very long time. He was the first one to endorse Thales. They found that Zayn, the Duke of Iris Flowers, who governed the South Coast Hill, was staring coldly at Koster, whose expression was initially stunned, but later turned bitter and frosty. Thales was stunned as he stared at Zayn, but Zayn did not seem like he was about to meet Thales' gaze. Count Karabayan and Count Lasha nodded. They walked forwards at the same time. I. Gilbert whispered to Thales. It seems like your strategy is still working. Under the circumstance, we are still able to win over valuable support. Duke Fakan has of Western Desert Hill suddenly let out a sharp laugh. I vote yes. Nay. Both Chroma and Bosdorf also voiced up. Under many people's puzzlement, Koster angrily yelled, "Old bones." Why? Fakan has cut Koster off and laughed. Why did I vote differently than Count Chroma and Count Bosdorf? Oh my, I am not their conferred ruler. I cannot govern them. Is that not very normal? He stared cynically at the other few dukes. After all, the 13 distinguished families are not the guard dogs for us 6 great clans. Many of the suzerains turned their heads around, their faces red. However, many of the king's partisans sighed and lowered their heads after counting the votes. 8 people opposed, 4 people agreed, and 1 person forfeited. With a trembling voice, Duke Cullen said, out of the 16 people here, more than half have already objected. It seems like we do not need to proceed any further. Gilbert lightly sighed. After Thales listened to the results, he could only give a bitter smile. Am I still too naive? For some unknown reason, Kessel V was able to remain expressionless even at this moment. People could only sigh and think that, after all, he was the supreme king, and this was the reason why he was able to remain this calm. At a corner some distance away, Morat let loose a faint laugh. The chief of the Secret Intelligence Department whispered, even though the child gave a brilliant performance, it still seems like we have to use the backup plan now. Are you ready for it? Raphael tightened his gloves as he replied joyfully, despite being a little taken by surprise, we can have nothing go wrong at this stage. Since the results are final, everyone, please not feel guilty anymore. Koster smiled as he looked at the suzerains, each one of them wearing a different expression on their faces. He then said, if you need a personal reason, this is for your own family. If you need an official reason. Koster looked scornfully at Jins, who gritted her teeth in anger, and at Thales, who looked defeated. Constellation cannot be governed by an ignorant woman and a child. Right at this moment, a crisp but rich young, female voice was heard from a distance. Ignorant woman and child? The crowd burst into a commotion. All the nobles on the balcony turned their heads and started to exchange whispers with one another after seeing the person who came. But I am ignorant too. The crisp and cold female voice seemed to have its own magical power, making its way through the crowd. I am also young and immature. Thales stretched his neck forward in bewilderment. Furthermore, I am a woman. The crowd was seen to separate under the royal guard's reprimand. A teenage girl of 14 or 15 years of age walked out from the crowd. Her chestnut-colored hair was draped over her shoulder and her pretty face was still visibly young as well as tender. However, at that moment, the teenage girl's expression was icy cold and stern as she stared at everyone standing on the balcony with a fierce gaze. She was wearing a pitch-black cape and leather boots with spurs on them. Her hunter's attire, which consisted of purple and black shades weaving between each other, dazzled the people who gazed at her. She wore a brooch on her left shoulder, and the pattern on the brooch looked like a blood-red, new moon. Without knowing why, Thales felt like this teenage girl with chestnut hair was trying her best to look cold and stern. The sounds of discussion from the crowd became increasingly louder. Many of the suzerains exchanged whispers in each other's ears after seeing the blood-red new moon, whilst all the dukes furrowed their brows. There were 2 nobles following the teenage girl with chestnut-colored hair. One of them was a smiling, strong man with pale blonde hair. He was in his prime years and his clothing had a gold sunflower woven onto it. Another noble was a middle-aged man with long hair and gloomy eyes. A 3-tailed big fish was woven onto his sleeve. The mouth of the fish was sinisterly wide, exposing densely packed, sharp teeth on the inside. I am precisely the one who was claimed to be an ignorant woman and a child. The teenage girl walked towards Koster. He was astonished. She lifted her head in arrogance, staring menacingly at the one-eyed man, who was a head taller than her. I am the one who governs the Blade Edge Hill of Constellation. The chestnut-haired girl's voice became icy cold. Do you have anything to say, Duke Nanchester, whom I am meeting for the first time today? Koster stared at her in disbelief. His only eye reflected his emotional turmoil. You are, Blood Moon, the T-Bark family. Duchess of Blade Edge Hill? The teenage girl with chestnut hair ignored him. She walked straight towards the king and kneeled down on one knee in front of him. Lyanna T-Bark. Kessel sighed as he reached his right hand out with a nostalgic look on his face. The last time I saw you should be around 12 years ago. You were only 3 years old at that time. I remember Sonia bringing John's body back to Eternal Star. She was holding you in her arms as tears were streaming down her face. She told me that you would be the next Duchess of T-Bark. Duchess Lyanna T-Bark, the serious-looking teenage girl lightly kissed the king's ring, and solemnly said, Your Majesty, I would never forget the kindness shown by you, Her Excellency Fortress Flower and the late Duke of Star Lake. Is this the only remaining orphan in T-Bark family who was rescued by the Duke of Star Lake from the rebel army during the Bloody Year? Duke Val sighed and stared at the strong teenage girl, who was even younger than his own daughter. The Southwest Territory is a long distance away, and the journey here is extremely difficult. I thought you are not able to make it here. Is this teenage girl really the remaining orphan of T-Bark family who was entirely murdered by the rebel army of the 6 southwestern cities during the Bloody Year? Val glanced at Kessel and sighed. This is similar to the Jadestar family. It took some time for me to gather the vassals and also recruit soldiers. Lyanna bowed before the Iron Eagle with great respect. Please be at ease. Since the kingdom is in trouble, T-Bark must give all we can, regardless of any sacrifices, reciprocation, gains, and failures. After listening to her speech, some counts snuck a look at Koshter. Meanwhile, the latter snorted and turned his head away. The vow is everlasting. Even if we are attacked by knives and swords, even if blood spills all over the ground, the Blood Moon will always stand by the side of the 9-pointed star family. Kessel V stared at this teenage girl, who looked firm and resolute. He slowly nodded his head, and noticed the 2 nobles behind her walking forward to kneel down and kiss his ring. Kessel earnestly said, Sukater, and also Kisen, I hope both of you are working closely together and helping one another. I hope the tragedy of the Bloody Year will never happen again. Of course, Your Majesty. Bruce Sukater, who was in his prime, gave a prudent smile. Even though the sunflower is located abroad by itself, it will always be related to constellation. Gunther Kisen swept over the entire place with his cold eyes. The piranhas will swallow everything that harms the Blood Moon and those enemies who harm the 9-pointed star, regardless whether the harm is from within or outside the country. Oh my, as expected of the General Edict of Constellation. Fakin has guffawed with his horrible and cynical laugh as he applauded. He then spoke again at the perfect moment. All of the 6 great clans and the 13 distinguished families are gathered here in the royal capital. It is a scene which has not been seen since 12 years ago. Cyril kept on laughing sharply while he continued, if there is no war with Extet, it would be even better. Of course, if there is no war, all of us would not need to be here too. Nobody paid him any attention. Everyone was speculating how things would be affected with the sudden arrival of the 3 great clans from Southwest Blade Edgehill and how their standpoints would also influence the situation. Koshter's expression immediately changed. He looked at Duke Cullen. His eyes were filled with urgency. But the old guardian Duke of the Eastern Sea did not spare him a glance. He spoke with his trembling voice, just right, this, Duchess Lyanna. However, he was immediately cut off by the cold-looking teenage girl. Enough with your nonsense. I am afraid that if you continue, you are going to have an asthma attack, old man whom I am meeting for the first time. Duke Cullen choked for a moment as he gaped in shock, not knowing how to react. The mayor of Blade City, the Duchess of the Blade Edgehill, Lyanna T-Bark agilely turned towards Thales. Thales promptly coughed and gave her an affable smile. Lyanna's sharp gaze sized Thales up, and he found that Lyanna had a pair of green eyes. He involuntarily stuck his chest out and stood a little more upright. As he was prepared to salute. Not bad, you do not look too ugly. Lyanna nodded and snorted coldly. Just that you are a little too skinny and short, and your expression is a little too uncultured. Expression, a little too uncultured? And also, this. Thales was stunned as he stood there. He pulled back his hand from the air, in which he was preparing to perform a salute. He exchanged a glance with Duke Cullen, who was in front of him. Both saw the empathy and understanding in each other's eyes. Lyanna turned around and stared firmly at all the nobles. Then, she proclaimed loudly, with regard to the possibility of him becoming the prince, I, Duchess T-Bark, vote yes. Before everyone could react to the statement, both Count Sukater and Count Kisen stepped forward from behind Lyanna, with one of them faintly smiling and the other glaring at the crowd fiercely. Both of them voiced up. I. Gilbert unconsciously tightened the hand he placed on Thales' shoulder in excitement. But Thales was too preoccupied to care. His heart was beating rhythmically once more. She agreed? The hall burst into an uproar again. The earth-shattering noise rose up within Star Plaza once more. Duke Cullen sighed. In that case, 8 people objected, 7 people agreed and 1 person forfeited. And because T-Bark family, Sukater family and Kisen family have arrived, all 19 people of the higher parliament are here. Right now, neither one of the oppositions or affirmatives vote is more than half. Therefore, only Javia of the Eastern Sea, Count Almond and I are left. Koshter clenched his fist tight as his heart sank. Damn it. That little bitch who governed T-Bark, Sukater the upstart, and Kisen, who behaved like a mad dog. Were they the long-prepared, hidden forces of the king? Impossible, not within such a short amount of time. Luckily, Cullen and the 2 families of Eastern Sea, who are under Cullen's influence, are still on New Star's side. They voted against the boy. The boy will not have the authority to succeed the throne, and we can take our time in making decisions. Just as Koshter was being immersed in his own thoughts, Duke Cullen decided to vote. Chapter 66, End of Arc, Thales Jadestar, the Second Prince. Cullen family, aye. Javia, aye. Almond, aye. The 3 agreements were voiced up one after another. Thales started to shiver as he started to count the number of votes in his mind. His breathing became involuntarily heavier after the thought. He looked over to Gilbert and the latter's eyes were filled with excitement, which he was trying very hard to suppress. On the other hand, Koshter Nanchester had his mouth wide open. He took an entire 20 seconds before he finally understood what had just happened. He stared in disbelief at the smiling, old Duke Cullen as his breath started to speed up. Dagestan and Count Sorrel who were standing behind him were also staring at each other in disbelief. What happened? Cullen was smiling by the time he began counting the votes while huffing and puffing. In that case, 8 people opposed, 10 people agreed and 1 person forfeited. More than half of the people have agreed. More at the Black Prophet's side as he watched the scene. It seems like we do not have to make an appearance anymore. The backup plan is cancelled. The situation was already decided the moment Iris Flowers switched sides. After all, it was the child's strategy that worked. Raphael gave out a lighthearted smile as he nodded and pulled up his gloves to his wrists. Duke Cullen squeezed out a smile on his plump face. The higher parliament has already made the decision that the constitution on illegitimate children is unsuited to be used against this child. This child shall have Jadestar as his last name, and he will have all the privileges of a prince. The bloodline of Jadestar is now carried on, and Constellation will have an heir. Congratulations, Your Majesty. Finally, Kessel V stingily gave out a smile and he nodded as a signal towards Gilbert. The hall once again exploded with the rising commotion. There were sounds of clapping, hurrahs and shouts. Additionally, there was a crowd, constantly pushing against the Royal Guard's line of defense. Koster did not listen to what Cullen said. He just stared at Duke Cullen, who was in front of him with his only eye widened. Bob Cullen. You are the starting point of everything. You are, but you traitor. Koster glared at Duke Cullen as he clenched his teeth together and spat out his words, let him become your future king. You will regret this one day. All the dukes had different expressions on their faces. Val was in a stunned state as he stared at Thales whereas Zayan stood with his arms crossed and smiled coldly. Fakenhez was staring at everyone with a delighted expression on his face. Lyanna's expression was still cold and callous as she occasionally swept her gaze over Thales. At this moment, Thales' brain was blank. Today's obstacle is over? With an excited look on his face, Gilbert waved his arm. He then took over a platter, which held a rolled-up document from an attendant beside him. Your Majesty, young sir. Even though it is a little crude and hurried, but the necessary ceremony must still be performed. Kessel V nodded without any expression on his face. Gilbert's hands were trembling as he passed the sealed scroll with a 9-pointed star symbol on it to the Supreme King. The nobles, who all had different expressions on their faces, slowly dispersed. They left the center of the balcony to the father-son pair. Kneel down. Kessel V still had mixed emotions on his face, but he was staring gravely at Thales. The boy adjusted his own breathing and kneeled down on his knee. This day, he said to himself, has come. Even though this was not a future he could choose, he wanted to choose it, or think of choosing it. However, he was like a small boat, sent drifting by huge waves in this dangerous and unknown world. He had no power in controlling his own destiny. The fact that he was able to stay alive was already a huge fortune and blessing. But now. Thales gazed at what was in front of him. Kessel V opened the seal on top of the scroll and slowly unraveled it. Thousands upon thousands of people in Star Plaza started to cheer, rave, rise to a clamor and applaud in excitement as they saw a small figure kneel down before the king. Some people even started to rush against the city defense team and police's line of order. Jadestar. Jadestar. In the name of Constellation, Southern Islands and Western Desert's 39th Supreme King, Kessel Mindy's 80 Jadestar. Kessel V stared intently at Thales with his sky-blue pupils as he read the contents of the scroll. This person before my eyes will be Jadestar's heir in Constellation's blood. The Sunset Goddess witnessed his bloodline. The Jadestar royal family vouched for his identity. The higher parliament recognized his power. Gods. King. Suzerains. The 3 main pillars of Constellation. Thales grabbed his knees increasingly harder with his hand as he involuntarily thought back to the national conference, which was full of ups and downs. Regardless of everything in your past, you will stand up as. Kessel V suddenly paused at that point of his speech. Unexpectedly, his hand, which held the scroll, trembled slightly. Thales furrowed his brows. He knew why the king stopped at this very moment. Thales' thoughts traced back to a few hours ago. Gilbert was going over Thales' last name with him at the final hallway leading to the Hall of Stars. According to usual practice, royal family members usually have 2 middle names, with the second one being the father's name and the previous one being an important person who has influenced you. They are usually any famous member in the royal family's history, for instance, the 3 Constellation Kings whom you previously met, enemy of the wolves Kira Jadestar of the Supreme Class, or Sumer Jadestar, the great musician. Are you sure you want to do this? You know, this name is even rarer than Thales. This will. Gilbert awkwardly followed Thales from behind. Yes. Sir Gilbert, I have already decided. Thales' eyes were determined as he walked forward one step at a time. Just like the brand and memory I have, no matter what the cost is, I still do not want to give up. I am about to become a Jadestar. He was panting slightly while recalling his experience at the royal family cemetery. But if I cannot hold my own future in my own hands, at least, please let me have control over my own name. Thales lifted his head up and walked forward with determination without any sign of turning back. Gilbert exchanged a glance with Jins, who had mixed emotions on her face. She nodded begrudgingly. His Majesty would probably not be happy about this. Return to present time. Just as the nobles were starting to furrow their brows and discuss about His Majesty the King's peculiar behavior, Kessel V took a deep breath like he was gathering all of his courage as well as willpower, and he mustered his energy. With his dignified and steady voice, he loudly declared, "You will stand up as Thales Thurin Girana Kessel Jadestar, the second prince of Constellation." Kessel V finished reading out the contents of the scroll. Both of his eyes were staring at Thales, but it seemed like he was immersed in his own thoughts. The nobles started to discuss among themselves. "Thurin Girana? Who is that?" Thales Jadestar slowly stood up from the ground. He was a Jadestar now. The second prince. And also, the only prince of Constellation. The only heir of the Supreme King. The guards hastily passed down the speech one layer after another, until it reached every corner of the Star Plaza. Deafening roars and cheers could be heard once again like tidal of waves, rising up and down. But this time, the chaotic but grand cries of the crowd soon became obvious and clear because they had a target to refer to. Thales Thurin Girana Kessel Jadestar. The second prince. The second prince. Thales Thurin Girana Kessel Jadestar. The second prince. The second prince. Under the earth-shattering, loud hurrahs, Thales looked up to the sky in a daze. The sun was setting in the east, and it gave out unending, brilliant red rays. The sun rays shone upon the walls of the majestic Renaissance palace, making the palace glow in shades of red. The color was just like blood. The evening had arrived. Today must have been hard on you. Gilbert walked forward in excitement, and lightly bowed before Thales. "Now, please follow me, Your Highness." Somewhere in Eastern Peninsula. Two men dressed in white robes, which were embroidered with a gold sun, were sitting by the bonfire in a murky, ruined building. The younger one between the two lifted his head and asked curiously, "Have you heard of it, Regulatory Affairs Officer? Recently there has been a disturbance in the Night Kingdom. I heard that many vampires have left and escaped to the Western Peninsula." The older Regulatory Affairs Officer nodded, his expression was cold and callous. "The temple has already sent people to investigate. But considering it is the Western Peninsula, Sunset Temple's power is stronger than ours, Sunrise Temple's, right?" The younger man stared at the Regulatory Affairs Officer, who seemed to seal his mouth shut on the matter, and probed. "I heard that people of the Western Peninsula could live in peace with vampires and werewolves. The Sunset Temple also abstained from hunting the creatures of the underworld. Could our people move about freely under Sunset Temple's power?" The Regulatory Affairs Officer lifted his head and looked at him coldly. "Why do you think our world is named Errol?" "Ha! I saw that when I was learning our language." The young Sunrise Temple priest scratched his head. "Errol is the holy sun god. He controls the sunrise and sunset, and decides the origin of all creatures. Is it not the reason why our world is named Errol?" The Sunrise Regulatory Affairs Officer snorted and smiled mysteriously. "You were sent to guard the pattern seal, but you do not have the rights to read our historic records, which is why you only know about these facts." The young priest's face was full of longing and curiosity. "Originally, our world was not named Errol. It was only after the Battle of Eradication that the name was changed to Errol." The Regulatory Affairs Officer said quietly. "After that horrendous battle, which almost ruined the world, the holy sun god, Errol, sacrificed himself. Otherwise, the outcome would not be as simple as the world being split into two peninsulas. Since then, the world was named after Errol in order to commemorate the holy sun god, his sacrifice, and his heroic move to save the world." The young priest widened his eyes in shock. "So, it was those disasters that led the holy sun god from the legends to..." The Regulatory Affairs Officer raised his hand without any emotion on his face and cut off the priest's rhetorical question before he continued. "Within the ashes of the holy sun, two gods succeeded his radiance, and rose up anew." The young priest seemed to understand something as his jaw dropped open. "That's right, Sunrise Lord and Sunset Goddess once governed the holy sun together as a single entity." The Regulatory Affairs Officer's eyes were glinting with ice and frost. "The holy sun shines upon all creatures. How is there any difference? Can Sunrise's priest move around in Sunset's range? That is the answer." But the Regulatory Affairs Officer added one more sentence in his heart while he stared at the elated priest. "Of course, at least that was what we thought. As for Sunset..." At this moment, the ruined and gloomy building suddenly shook. Dust was falling off the tumbling stone pillars. Both of their expressions changed at that moment. "No way." They leapt onto their feet and ran desperately as well as vigilantly towards the center of the building. "Prepare the message candles and do not be stingy on using them." The Regulatory Affairs Officer yelled as if he was facing a formidable enemy. "Prepare yourself for the worst in tackling this sort of evil." They had reached their destination. A weird picture had been drawn using peculiar paint on the stone floor of the uttermost center of the dark and gloomy building. The picture was a roughly 10-meter wide circle with weird and bizarre formulas and letters on it. The innermost center of the circle was a drawing of a six-fingered black claw. The shaking was still going on. The young priest's eyes were filled with confusion as he put away the white candle with gold patterns that was in his palm. He furrowed his brows and said, "The sealing rune is still in good condition. It has not struggled loose." However, the Regulatory Affairs Officer was still highly vigilant. As he felt the vibration, he turned around with a serious expression and asked, "But what just happened? This type of shaking?" The young priest seemed to remember something as he pulled out an ancient, black book from his bosom in a flurry. He hastily flipped to a page and read it out with much difficulty. Unfathomable shaking, got it. It is right here. But after the priest read for a while, he immediately lifted his head up and stared at the Regulatory Affairs Officer, perplexed. The Regulatory Affairs Officer asked unpleasantly, "What? You are the only one here who went through the complete training of the ancient empire's language." "No, according to what is written in this notebook, the occasional agitation of the seal is very normal." The young priest furrowed his brows and continued, "But the sudden activity of the sun, the tide of the moon, the changes of the flow in Hell's river, or the 7 kings of hell picking their noses or yawning, the kingdom of all gods deciding to remodel their bedrooms when they are free, God, what are all these disrespectful terms, a number of supreme class experts passing by, could result in the sealed being's name being called by many people at the same time. These are the possible causes for the fluctuation of energy and the agitation of life, the degree of severity is not the same." The priest flipped through the notebook and sighed helplessly under the thundering sound caused by the shaking. "God, I am so done with these wizards. For a single question, there are 6 to 7 different requirements and more than 20 possible answers. And there is a to be continued label at the end of the writing. What is the difference with not finding an answer? No wonder they became extinct. There should be something that has the highest possibility of happening. Are we just going to disregard this matter?" the Regulatory Affairs Officer asked as he forced down his anger. The young priest fumbled through the pages of the notebook in a hurry, his eyebrows tightly furrowed together. "I do not know. I am just a third-grade white-robed priest of the Sunrise Temple, I am not." At this moment, the shaking suddenly halted. Both of them raised their heads and exchanged a glance. They could see confusion and relief in each other's eyes. The shaking did not come back again. The Regulatory Affairs Officer heaved a sigh of relief then, glared fiercely at the priest before he turned around and left. The priest looked at the Regulatory Affairs Officer's back and continued his speech in a tone that indicated that he was wronged. "I am not an extinct wizard or witch, who knows about everything and can use a variety of methods to make sense of everything." The Regulatory Affairs Officer spoke without turning his head. "You should be glad that they are all dead." His voice was full of anger. The priest, whom the Regulatory Affairs Officer had vented his anger upon, glanced at the 6-fingered black claw and rolled his eyes. "If those wizards are not dead." The Regulatory Affairs Officer's figure disappeared behind the stone pillar, but his annoyed voice still made its way over. "Would a rookie like you have a chance in guarding the sealing rune over here? Of course I would not have the chance to be here if the wizards are not extinct, but—" The young priest raised his eyebrows and glanced at the circle on the ground with the corner of his eye before he shook his head and held up his palms helplessly. What a joke. Chapter 67, The Winter Solstice. Arc 3, Dancing with the Dragon. To Zadie, my dear friend and teacher. It has been half a year since we last corresponded. I cannot wait to share what I have heard and saw in Eternal Star City for the past 3 months with you. According to your suggestion and method, I have already overcome what you called the battlefield abstinence syndrome. I can now sleep on beds, I have stopped subconsciously pulling out my sword whenever I hear footsteps behind me, and the noise of blacksmiths striking steel has ceased to make me go into a paranoid state anymore. My father arranged for me to join the police station and work under his old classmate from his military academy. Have you ever heard of the name Horse Slayer Lord Lorbeck Dara? Relying on the excellent sword skills that you have taught me, do not misunderstand, I am praising you, not boasting about myself. Along with the rarely seen power of eradication, I am only boasting about myself in this part. I already became a Class 2 police officer and the captain of the public security team when I first started this job. But in my heart, I understand that I was able to get this position mainly because of my last name, Karabayan. You would not believe what I went through in a mere 3 months. There were too many surprises, and I had to straighten them out one by one. Just as I mentioned before, Constellation is an old but decadent kingdom. Being one of the remnants of the past empire's bloodline is no longer a glory, but more like a burden. You can hardly imagine it. In such a place as the capital there are already many cases of disputes and shady deals regarding the administrative power solely within the police station. Efficiency and efficacy are very low. It is practically unbearable for me, let alone the commoners. This resulted in the street order and some vital operations of a few regions being controlled by gangs. This is because to the people, the gangs' channels of communication are a lot faster, better, reliable and more convenient than the officials. Under a coincidence brought by fate, I got acquainted with an informant from the Blackstreet Brotherhood. It was right under this situation that I got into the life and death fight between the 2 largest gangs of Constellation in the capital. It once again renewed my understanding towards gangs, these people who are not part of the government. Regardless of the innumerable ordinary class and superclass experts, there were also a few psionic warriors who emerged, each of them qualified to earn a place in legendary Winged Stardust unit. There is only one thing that I really care about. Do you still remember those swordsmen you told me about before, who abandoned their initial hearts to wield the sword? The mission that was the cause for the Tower of Eradication's existence? You mentioned before that their swords had transformed into unadulterated weapons of massacre. Their power of eradication had also transformed to the purest form of death's power, just like the calamities whom our seniors swore a deathly vow to deal with. Even though almost 100 years has passed by since that matter, I truly believe that I met a swordsman of eradication outside the tower, just like the disastrous swordsman you mentioned. When facing the violent power of eradication that was filled with desire for massacre, the never-fading glory of the stars, which I was extremely proud of, was absolutely no match for it. When that power invaded my body, it was practically, I could not help but think, what kind of lunatic could withstand the power of eradication, flowing in every direction within his body? If I had not received unexpected help, what you would probably be receiving right now is the obituary to my funeral. In short, I already have the knowledge and I have experienced the power of eradication where killing intent and violent rage exist together. That swordsman came from Blood Bottle Gang. That is right, it is the gang that was established by those two calamities at the end of Mindy's III's reign over 100 years ago. Reportedly, one of them is already missing in the capital. I believe that it was the kingdom's wrath himself who did the deed. Other than him and his bow, who else in the capital could have been in close proximity to those calamities? Curiosity made me read a lot of books when I was recovering. I had also read some forbidden books and police records in my father's honor. To my surprise, I discovered the following truth: mysterious superclass swordsmen of different abilities appeared 17 times during the 100 years of the Blood Bottle Gang's establishment. The killing and destructive power they showed were not things that could be done by the usual superclass swordsmen of eradication. On the contrary, there were similarities with the swordsman I encountered. It seemed like the disastrous swordsman I encountered was not the only instance that suddenly appeared. Here is another inference: when those two calamities secretly established Constellation's Blood Bottle Gang 100 years ago, the disaster swords also committed an act of betrayal and got out of the Tower of Eradication 100 years ago. They then built a sword of eradication beyond our tower as a legacy for future generations. Do these two parties really have no connection at all? What I am more worried about is, during those 100 years, did the Tower of Eradication really have no knowledge of the relationship between the legacy beyond our tower and Constellation's Blood Bottle Gang? Why have we turned a blind eye on this matter? By all possible means, Zadie, my beloved teacher, I feel like the answer lies in the truth of the betrayal towards the Tower of Eradication by Crassus and his followers. I need to go back to the Tower of Eradication as soon as possible. At the same time, I am asking you to give me the reading permit of the books of science. That is all about Blood Bottle Gang. However, the other gang was not in any way inferior to them. My informant told me that Blackstreet Brotherhood had a very strange rise to power. They were established during the Bloody Year. At that point of time, they were just a bunch of mercenaries and adventurers who fought to survive with a blade hanging over their heads. Even though they were very powerful, approximately within 10 years, they had already infiltrated half of Constellation's underworld and extended their hands towards Extet and Camus Union. Blood Bottle Gang had the Mystic's glorified name to help them be in charge, and this was also the byproduct of the evil associations between the nobles and bureaucrats. But what was the source for Blackstreet Brotherhood's emergence? The informant's news entails that they had a very secretive but vigorous support in funding and networking. Speaking of which, I would like to ask, have you ever heard of the name Black Sword? According to urban folklore, he was the leader of Blackstreet Brotherhood. He was of an elite class and had great skills with the sword. There were some people who claimed that he was very good at hiding and was the most dangerous king of assassins. There are even some reports from the police station, which say his sword was some sort of cursed antique. It was supposedly equipped with immeasurable ability and power. But one point is certain: he is a Supreme Class expert. During the past 10 years, one Supreme Class Knight of Eradication and one Supreme Class Psionic Warrior were suspected to have been murdered by him, as he was there with them when the event happened. Even though the differences between these Supreme Class experts were huge, and it was very hard to predict who would win and lose, I still could not help but wonder, killing two Supreme Class experts at the same time, is there really a swordsman that powerful outside the Tower of Eradication's watch? I also suspected that he was the descendant of Disaster Sword, but he was hostile towards Blood Bottle Gang, and he was under Blackstreet Brotherhood. This caused me to remain perplexed despite much thought. An even bigger affair happened during Constellation's national conference on the day before. Teacher, you may have already received the news from the messenger crows. Constellation now has a legitimate heir. He is not one of the clans or nobles, nor is he from a branch of the royal family. The prince is a real person, named Thales Jadestar. I know that back in the day, the sort of reversing light Prince Horace was your schoolmate. What are your comments on Jadestar? As for me, I witnessed the new, second prince's elegant demeanor behind my father. Although he is only 7 years old, I can only say that Jadestar is indeed a part of the royal family. But this is not the best moment for him to make his appearance. The Jadestar royal family is facing some rarely seen stress. The Exted diplomat group was murdered in Constellation. Yes, Zadie, my dear friend and teacher, I once again smell the stench of war. In my father's opinion, regardless of how we try to resolve this, the conflict between the dragon and Constellation is indeed unavoidable. Sorry, teacher. The swordsmen and knights that the Tower of Eradication made much fuss to preserve for humans, these warriors, who previously used their superpowers to open and develop the future of humans, and who once used their power of eradication to fighting the calamities, have to once again pick up their swords and battle to death on the battlefield for their respective kingdoms. If war erupts, I can only pray to the Sunset Goddess to not let me encounter Croftash and Missadun. I cannot help but tremble when I think of my time in the Tower of Eradication and also when I think of piercing the sword into the hearts of others. Also, Miranda has already spent 3 years in Broken Dragon Fortress and she is going to serve in the army with honor and glory under the fortress flower. But this also means that, if the war erupts, she will be the first one to face the bloodbath. Other than that, I also met Raphael in the national conference. He is now working for the kingdom's secret intelligence department, and he is also contributing his power to this kingdom. But please believe me, teacher, your worry will not come to pass. From my enlistment to my service, I have already seen a lot. However, reality will not change me. The ambitions of the other two and mine will never change as well. Especially me, after I went through the cruelest battle. Only then did I begin to realize how precious life is. After I saw the ugliness of this kingdom, the more I long for the arrival of revolution. One day, we will use our own strength to rebuild this gradually outdated and old kingdom. I hope everything goes smoothly for you, and that you will successfully woo teacher Chartier as soon as possible. P.S. It is already winter over here in Constellation, and soon, it will be snowing in Eternal Star City. How is the weather at your place? From your faithful friend and student, Cohen Karabayan Calendar of Eradication, year 672, December 16th, morning, written at home. In front of the everlasting lamp, Cohen stopped writing and scrutinized his letter for a long time before he sighed. The blonde policeman hesitated over and over again. Still, he scribbled off the line he is now working for the kingdom's secret intelligence department, and also contributing his power to this kingdom, and wrote this instead: I will confirm his current situation before writing to you again. He stood up from his desk and glanced outside the window of his family's manor. It was just 6 o'clock in the eastern city district and dawn had just arrived. The visibility of the street was quite high. Even though it was still early, many servants of the nobles were walking around, especially lately when various major events frequently happened in and out of the kingdom. Cohen shook his head when he thought of this. The kingdom indeed has its heir now, but it also caused the confrontation between the royal family and suzerains during the national conference yesterday. How are they going to resolve the conflict with Extet? He did not think that Duke Nanchester, after going through such humiliation, would still answer to the king's call because of his sense of duty. Those petty suzerains of the western desert did not seem to be like nobles who worked together during the kingdom's crisis. The plump Duke of the Eastern Sea was even more infamous for his stinginess. The only people left were the unpredictable teenager, Duchess of Blade Edge Hill and Iris Flowers of South Coast Hill, who changed his stance at the very last minute. However, they were too far away to serve as immediate help. So, the first battle will be the burden of the Northern Territory and the royal family? Constellation is really like a hydra, Cohen thought to himself. He immediately thought of the hydra, Kilika, which was killed by the human hero, Extet's founding king, Rykaro Extet. His mood then became increasingly gloomier. The sound of horses galloping could be heard from the street outside the window. A troop of knights were riding their horses out from buildings that were specifically for attending to nobles from abroad. However, their rhythm in riding the horses and their strength in whipping them were different from the knights Constellation usually saw. Constellation's knights were particular about harmony and rhythm while they rode on horseback. Their rhythm was stable and constant, and their whipping was just right. Yet, these knights were ferocious in their rhythm and they practiced an extremely strong force while they whipped their horses. Nonetheless, their collective pace was precisely united and firm in discipline. It had some resemblance to the knights of the Northern Territory. Wait a minute. Cohen's pupils shrank abruptly. He saw the flag that the troop of knights held. Squeak! Cohen pushed the window open in a rush. He stuck his head out of the window as he wanted to get a clear look at the flag. The color of that flag stood out from Constellation's flag. It had a black base with red outlines, and on top of the flag, there was a roaring red dragon. The dragon's claws appeared to be ferocious. Its wings were wide open and its eyes were purely black. It was indeed a straightforward but fierce style. The blonde police officer was slightly stunned. Did they arrive yesterday after midnight? The city gate blocked their entry and made them rest at the inn outside the city, but now they are letting them come into the city? Is this His Majesty's idea? Suddenly, Cohen felt a chilling sensation on his face. It was freezing enough to make him tremble. Cohen stretched out his hand to touch his face, and he felt a piece of snowflake on it. The police officer was stunned. He stretched his hand out of the window and caught a second and third piece of snowflake. White, glittering flakes of snow fell down everywhere from the sky above. It was snowing. Cohen took a deep breath and glanced upwards to the sky. Winter had arrived. Early morning. He woke up from the Renaissance Palace's unique, rock-hard stone bed. He slid down from the bed, and unsurprisingly stepped onto the freezing cold, stone ground. It seemed to be colder than yesterday. A day had passed since the unforgettable national conference. Thales felt like he was living in a dream that day. It was hard to imagine this. That afternoon, he walked one step at a time with Gilbert leading him from the Hall of Stars to the star-blue carpet, ignoring the continuous arguments between the king and suzerains behind him. The nobles, bureaucrats, and people on each side were bowing down to him. They were calling him, Your Highness. Thales, Your Highness. Are you hallucinating because you are too excited? Thales was snapped out of his thoughts abruptly. He lifted his head and saw Jins. The mature and charming female official leaned against the stone doorframe with her arms crossed as she calmly looked at him. No, I am not. The new second prince of Constellation, Thales replied flatly. I just feel like the situation is somewhat surreal. I am also at a loss. Jin stared at him as she snorted. Of course, previously you were just a nobody, but now you are a prince. Prince Thales, the second prince of Constellation. No, it is not that simple. Thales sighed with a bitter smile on his face. He buttoned up his shirt and grabbed his jacket. Previously, I only had to think about how to keep living. But from now on, what I need to consider is how to stay alive. Thales silently replied as he fastened the last button of his leather belt. Jins furrowed her brows and then raised them. Just another jade star. She silently thought to herself. A pitiful jade star. Thales fastened his leather boots, but that sentence kept replaying in his mind. To fight for Constellation, to die for Constellation, and to live for Constellation. Am I really ready for this? He paused for a short while before fastening the sheath JC's dagger onto the belt across his lower back. Are you ready, Your Highness? A familiar voice made its way from beyond the door. Gilbert's figure appeared at the entrance, his face was clouded with an unusual, solemn air. Jin sighed and made way for the former Foreign Affairs Minister. Gilbert took off his hat and bowed before Jin's as he said to Thales, "Please forgive me for disturbing you from your sleep on just the second day, Your Highness. But, please hurry up in getting ready." Thales gave him a puzzled look. Gilbert took a deep breath. "They are coming, Your Highness. His Majesty hopes that you will stand by his side and greet those people with him." "Those people?" Thales asked in confusion. But he immediately understood what was being said. The prince also stared solemnly back at Gilbert. "Yes, those people." Gilbert nodded and pursed his lips tightly together. He was hesitant, but eventually, with his voice firm and steady, he said, "The extensions." Chapter 68, Dominance of the Capable. To the majority of constellations, their impressions of the extensions were of this, hardy people who also had the ability to withstand extremely cold weather. However, the second impression may have differed. Most of the civilians would scratch their heads in uncertainty and say that they were barbaric and rude. Whereas the merchants would merrily utter, trustworthy, and good business. The mercenaries and the adventurers would laugh mysteriously and tell you that whether it was for assaults or retreats, the extensions were the best choice. Old soldiers who had encountered them would frown, then sigh after a sip of beer and a puff of tobacco. From the memories that were deeply etched within their memories, they would remind you not to trifle with extensions. But based on Thales' knowledge of the peninsular's history, at least the aristocrats and feudal lords of Constellation held an absolutely different, complex point of view towards this strong northern neighbor. Being the most powerful nation in the western peninsula, Extet possessed intimidating, formidable military might with amazing records of victories in wars. Even among the three strong and credible allies during the Peninsular War, Extet remained a ferocious and dreadful dragon to the others when the alliance turned confrontational. In contrast to the orderly and methodically delicate Constellation, this was an intrepid state, filled with romantic and rebellious moods, coupled with heroic and belligerent spirits. Its long tradition traced back even way earlier than the ancient empire. From the remote, uncivilized era where the Northern King established the alliance of all beasts with the orcs to the time the Iron Blood King gloriously sacrificed himself during mankind's last defense against the orcs, the most frigid gust of cold wind had swept past this northern territory, which was occupied by humans, waking them up from their weak, uncivilized age. During the age of feudal kings, the final Quaker War saw 2,000 armored human cavaliers charge courageously to the front line in the Holiness Exorcism campaign. They had to fence off the 20,000 heavily armed orc soldiers in the final feud to rid themselves off the offenders. Later on, the Northern Knights gathered under the Emperor's flag, with swords and flames raging all over the ground, and conquered the land to establish the ancient empire. These various events in the Northern Territory manifested how the human race used their knives and swords to become the most powerful weapons in the world. In the Northern Province during the Age of the Empire, the revolutionary king, Quiso's attempt to revolt against the tyrannical emperor may have been relatively unknown in this self-proclaimed, authentic imperial state that was Constellation. However, Thales had read before that the revolutionary king only led 300 soldiers in assaulting the three great armies of the empire when he was old, but he was killed in the glorious, revolutionary attempt. This event indeed aroused the awareness that the seemingly strong and powerful empire was in actual fact infested with multiple problems and internal strife. This marked the prelude to civil unrests in the empire. An event closer to the contemporary Extet was none other than the Battle of Eradication, which changed the world. During the darkest and most despair-filled moment, the heroic Raikuru and his knights descended from the sky and charged into the enemy's headquarters. This battle was the reversal gust, which rekindled the flame of hope in revolutionary movements not only in the northern provinces, but also the entire world. It also saved the northern and western fronts, which were in imminent danger, not to mention the chaotic and fragmented post-war continent. Together with his 9 dedicated knights, he founded the legendary Extet. Even more recently, the legendary adventures of the Extet-born hero Chara, the Oathkeeper Midir and Kaplan the Prophet as well as their alliance during the Third Peninsular War against the Eastern Peninsular Alliance, remained as stories Aurelians loved to dwell upon with great relish until now, at least that was the case in Western Peninsular. In comparison, Constellation resembled an aging gentleman, encumbered with heavy imperialistic, orthodox beliefs. Even the nation's founding story was filled with bitterness and sorrow. Extet, on the other hand, was more like a robust young warrior that flourished with resistance and heroism, one who would charge without fear and die without regrets. With that spirit, an extension was now before Thales. Ignoring the hostile gaze of the officials and aristocrats from Constellation in the hall, Baron LaSalle Weeder, the emergency envoy from Extet, stood upright in Renaissance Palace, which was adjacent to the conference hall in the Hall of Stars. Standing casually, with both arms folded and his head lowered, he occasionally lifted his head up to sweep his view around the hall, but this was done with grace and not the slightest rudeness. Seemingly, this was his nature, however the inconspicuous smile on his face did make the spectators frown. LaSalle appeared to only be slightly over 40 years old, and as he held a red-colored dragon print scroll in his hand, LaSalle showed no signs of fear. Instead, he looked somewhat arrogant. When his antagonistic eyes swept through the hall, people in the hall who met his gaze had the false impression that this extension was giving them haughty looks instead of them staring and judging his envoy. Under this circumstance, Thales pursed up his lips tightly, stood by Gilbert's side at a concealed and inconspicuous location, which was a few stairs up, beside the King of Constellation's seat. Those present in the hall ranged from the 6 dukes from the 6 great clans, who had identical expressions, the 13 counts from the distinguished families, to the various officials participating in the conference, Chief of Intelligence Morad Hansen, Minister of Finance Gilman, Military Advisor Sean Ritter and so on, all stood quietly beside the king's seat. The entire center of power within Constellation was waiting for King Kessel V to speak as he sat on his throne. Yet, King Kessel V's sky-blue eyes were carefully observing the emergency envoy dispatched by Extet when Prince Moriah was assassinated. To be able to cross the borders from Dragon Cloud City non-stop and head straight to Eternal Star City in just 6 days showed just how urgent the matter was, and what the attitude this envoy possessed. "What have you brought, envoy of the Northern Dragon?" King Kessel's voice traveled through the air. "Me? Poof. I personally have brought nothing." Extet's emergency envoy LaSalle laughed briefly, but all of a sudden, his expression turned cold. "Very soon, all of Extet will bring their griefs, their despairs, and also, their fury." The entire conference hall turned dead silent. Baron LaSalle stared intensely at King Kessel without backing down even the slightest. During the suffocating silence, just as Thales wondered who would be the first to bring up the main subject, Kessel V broke the silence. "I know you." The king uttered slowly, his dignified voice spread to the entire conference hall. 12 years ago, the current Archduke of Black Sand, who was then Count Chapman Lampard and also the Count for a single city, represented Extet to visit Constellation as the son of the Archduke. You held the reins to his horse in that diplomatic group. Whom? Astounded by Kessel's good memory, LaSalle frowned a little. Then, he laughed lightly. LaSalle's laughter was filled with an irritating, mocking tone. "What an amazing memory, your majesty. I too remember very clearly, you were only the 5th prince then. You stood at a corner, all alone." With his hands behind his back, he walked forward and continued, "Look at Chapman Lampard. He strongly proposed to the old, gray-haired King 80, who had suffered a great deal by constant rebellious unrest. As long as they returned the 5 counties, which originally belonged to the Northlanders back to their rightful masters. Extet will generously dispatch an army down south to help quell the intensifying rebellious unrests that have been plaguing our neighbors for 600 years. Many frowned upon hearing this. Suffering a great deal from the constant rebellious unrest, the bloody year. Thales recalled this event. But Thales also took note that this envoy had placed emphasis on Northlanders before Extet. What was the implication? Well, I remember King 80 had politely declined Grand Duke Lampard's so-called proposal. Duke Fakin has sneered. Yet, you still generously sent your army to the south. What a good neighbor you have been. LaSalle smiled mysteriously without saying a word. Count Zamunto said angrily, maybe Archduke Lampard was not so literate. Those 5 counties you mentioned have been respectively ruled by the Arundi, Zamunto, and Fries families. Our ancestors owned those lands ever since the founding of Constellation. Those are indisputably Constellation's lands. Out of Thales' expectation, LaSalle laughed. Under the angry eyes of the entire hall, his soft laugh gradually turned into a big hearty laugh. All these years, cold winds have been getting stronger and more frigid in Extet. Our shepherds and hunters have to tolerate this bitter cold weather when they are out. When they return, they have to use snow to vigorously rub their nearly frostbitten hands to prevent their hands from freezing. Most people could not grasp what he was trying to say. LaSalle laughed grimly. Year after year, decade after decade, we managed to turn our trembling hands, which were only good for wielding whips and holding bows, into steady and strong arms, fit to brandish powerful swords. LaSalle paused momentarily and looked around before he laughed unscrupulously. In comparison, the weather in Constellation is getting warmer and more comfortable, well suited for weaklings, who are only good at gasping for breath on women's bellies. Such as the descendant of the Oathkeeper, my dear. This instantly caused an uproar in the hall. Thales was shocked. How could a visiting envoy choose to abuse and insult the host rather than get into the main subject? Somehow, he reckoned that so far as the incident of the prince's assassination was concerned, Constellation was in an absolutely disadvantageous position. Besides, from the parliamentary meeting the day before, one could easily gauge Constellation's military might and strength. Henceforth, it looked like Extet held complete reins over whether they wanted to hold Constellation accountable, when they wanted to hold Constellation accountable, and how they wanted to hold Constellation accountable over the incident. Thales heaved a sigh. Count Fries slammed his hand on the sword hanging by his waist, and with rage burning in him, he asked, "What are you getting at?" But Kessel V calmly waved his hand, waving off the enraged nobles who were about to rush forth. "What I am saying is, since when did the lousy excuse of the land belonging to my grandfather valid to set the standard for claiming land ownership?" LaSalle took a circular stroll in the hall, and met the gazes of Constellation's aristocrats and feudal lords with his fearless stare. LaSalle spoke with a hostile expression. Regardless of Extet or Constellation, the strong and the victor would only leave after claiming his spoils of war, while the weak or loser would have to give up his gambling chips to protect himself. Every inch of land has to be conquered. These are the international laws. Just as Senjum, the king of mountains of the East Peninsula, said, only the able shall dominate. Only Gilbert and a few others slightly shut their eyes, pondering what his intentions were. King Kessel looked as if he was in deep thought while he swept his sight across the nobles in the hall. Gilbert whispered to Thales, "Be careful, Prince Thales. In diplomatic affairs, there should not be any meaningless arguments or exchanges. This is actually a test and a change of steps before the official clash of swords. The opponent is probing our steps and our ability, before finally making his first sword strike. The fact that he did not urgently dive into the main subject implies that he may not have good grounds to put forward conditions, but it is also probable that he has some even better points for negotiation." Gilbert continued softly, "Up till now, this is his plot. By infuriating and directing us towards the topics of military strength and the rules of the strong versus the weak, he is planting a seed in our thoughts. At the same time, he is gauging our response to determine his next move. Moreover, when he finally brings up the real topic of discussion, we would lean towards the tendency of thinking about war, unconsciously placing more importance in the value of war and hence, neglecting other equally important alternatives. Do we have other choices? Thales frowned. LaSalle stepped forward and stared at King Kessel with a burning gaze. Does Constellation have the ability to guard and defend your so-called territory? The anger and rage among the aristocrats had now reached the limit. With extreme rage and a swift tap on his northern military uniform, the northern Count Zamonto shouted, bring on your army. But his words were immediately cut off by an even more firm and stable voice. All right. Valarandi had on a composed smile. His firm voice drowned out Zamonto's and echoed throughout the conference hall. Very well, as the Duke of the Northern Territory, I was actually worried about my territory not being big enough. Since Grand Duke Lampard desires our 5 counties in the north, and I have been wanting his Black Sand region, then how about we dispatch our troops and exchange out territories based on our capabilities? Upon the Northern Duke's rebuttal, Extet's emergency envoy frowned slightly but soon smiled afterwards. The Duke of the Northern Territory has given a very good response, but what Count Zamonto said earlier may have exposed some information to the opponent, Gilbert solemnly reported to the second Prince of Constellation. Thales nodded. He understood. In the face of provocation, Count Zamonto challenged the opponent to a fight, whereas Val chose to declare his intention to conquer his opponent's land. The meanings behind their words and their attitudes as well as their resolve towards being invaded instantly showed a big difference. Right at this moment, a young girl's gentle voice interrupted the ongoing conversation. The able shall dominate? If this is the case, then that Archduke of Black Sand should rise to arms soon, get rid of your King Nuvan, and capture the throne. Upon hearing this, LaSalle's facial expression turned drastically. Because I do believe that he is actually stronger than King Nuvan, is he not? To fight the south, he has to face an entire empire, but to fight the north, he only has a king to deal with. Why not give it a try? Perhaps, he will succeed. Under the astounded eyes of the spectators, the 15-year-old Duchess of Blade Edge Hill, Lyanna T-Bark sat among the male suzerains like a lone flower on the cliff. She continued coldly, why don't you bring these words to the Grand Duke Lampard of Black Sand? Just as Senjem the King of Mountains said, only the capable shall dominate. Chapter 69, Creator of Bad Precedents, 1. In the hall, the senior ministers and suzerains began to whisper among themselves, even smiles could be seen on some of their faces. Duke Cullen laughed heartily and whispered to the unpopular Duke Fakenez, she's a good girl. Did she learn to be so biting with her words from you? Biting with her words? Not at all, Cyril Fakenez said softly with warped lips, and he giggled with a sinister smile. To me, this is a woman's natural ability. Back in the hall, LaSalle's facial expression froze, and then he burst out in anger. So, is it Constellation's style to use this sort of method to sow discord between Extet's king and his subjects? It is just like how you have shamelessly and despicably plotted to murder our Prince Mariah. Thales' heart lurched in his chest. Here comes the main course. His statement caused most of Constellation's nobles in the hall to feel indignant and angered. Yet, there were few who fell into deep thought. Before Thales could respond, Gilbert spoke with a praising smile, the Duchess' reaction is commendable. We have unknowingly launched a counterattack. Your Highness, Duchess T-Bark's attack should bring us some positive results. Thales turned around and looked at the elegant Duchess. Lyanna also seemed to have sensed Thales' gaze, and turned around to return it with a fierce stare. It was as sharp as a blade. Thales hastily delivered a smile, then took a quick glimpse around the hall, pretending like nothing had happened, as if his gaze on the Duchess earlier was actually unintentional. This is not as simple as merely sowing discord. It helps to probe into whether King Nuvan and the Duke of Black Sand have uniform wills as well as objectives. This is very important. Thales was dumbfounded. Gilbert continued patiently, the fact that LaSalle abruptly reverted back to the main subject is an indication. Obviously, he also knows that he better not get entangled in the subject of who is stronger between King Nuvan and the Archduke of Black Sand. In the first round, he was the one who was forced to strike first. Recalling Gilbert's inference in the carriage earlier, Thales suddenly realized that the assassination of the Extet diplomat group could have been a deliberate attempt of certain people in their own country. Looks like, though there is no evidence, but, no matter what. At least, in the minds of most people, the discord between King Nuvan and the Archduke of Black Sand was quite huge. He returned his gaze to the hall. The one-eyed dragon of Nanchester snorted. We murdered your prince? Even an idiot would be able to tell that the assassination of your diplomatic group was a plot to stir up warfare between our countries. Is Extet going to be used so easily and willingly? Even my hunting hounds are not as obedient as you are. Constellations, do you think we really care whether you are an innocent bystander or the instigator? LaSalle spoke slowly. Since you are not interested in finding out the truth, why are you here? How about you just behead some of the people on the streets and give it back to your King Nuvan? Duke Zayn of South Coast Hill said sarcastically. These words did not fail to stir up LaSalle's burning rage and enmity. Under the watchful eyes of the nobles, he strode forward, then held the crimson dragon sealed scroll up high in his right hand. On the throne, King Kessel clenched both his fists and lowered his chin. His gaze turned gloomy and abstruse. No matter who despicably murdered the prince, we swear to destroy them. Extet will uphold justice ourselves, we do not need anybody else. But our prince, the only son and heir of the Archduke of Dragoncloud City and the common elected king of Extet, died in Constellation's territory. LaSalle spread his arms, vigorously turned and ruthlessly gazed at each and every suzerain, noble and official in the hall. His last drop of blood fell on the land of Constellation, the last breath he took was the air in Constellation, the last scene he saw was the scenery in Constellation. He came to Constellation with goodwill, yet all of you could not and did not protect him. Regardless of whether he was killed intentionally or not, it was your incompetence and your conniving attitude which have caused his death. That is good enough. Constellation should be responsible for it, and should pay the price. Angrily, LaSalle tore open the seal from the Crimson Dragon sealed scroll. Then, he swiftly unfurled it. No matter what, King Nuvan and Extet must obtain some form of justification from Constellation. The 6 dukes almost frowned simultaneously. Thales' pupils contracted, only to see that the fully written scroll had no signature or a seal stamp. It only had a palm print. A bright red palm print. Could it be King Nuvan's bloody palm print? Commotion returned to the hall. I saw it with my own eyes. He did not sign it, he did not put a seal. He just cut his palm and pressed it down to make a palm print. This is King Nuvan's anguish and despair. Do you understand now, Constellations? The last few words uttered were as if they were spat out through LaSalle's teeth. The commotion in the hall began to gradually subside. Prior to this, Thales did not care much about the assassination of the Extet diplomat group. The death of the foreign prince, who was a total stranger to him, caused no pain to him. Yet now, he finally realized the seriousness of this matter. The Supreme King's sonorous voice rose up once again. I can comprehend King Nuvan's despair and anger. Believe me, I have experienced that sort of feeling, and Constellation will definitely not evade its responsibility. Kessel spoke in an indifferent manner. The one-eyed dragon Koshter gnashed his teeth, though in a barely noticeable manner. Is the king about to yield? Is it possible? How would the northern ferocious dragon be fully satisfied unless we pay a hefty price for cutting off a big chunk of meat from our northern territory? If we give in, King Kessel will end up being labeled incompetent and weak. Moreover, we will be destined to have our relationship with the northern territory sour even further. They are not exactly good friends of ours now. As he thought about these things, he could not help but look at Valorundi, who was in full military uniform, frowning but keeping absolute silence. It seemed as if this was the calm before a storm. LaSalle put down his hand and continued coldly, Thank you for your understanding, your majesty. Oh yes, I remember now. Ho-ho, if it is you, whatever you say, we can understand. Strange looks appeared among those presented in the hall. Cut the nonsense. What are King Nuvan's conditions? Kessel ignored his underlying mocking words and asked him outright. Under the watchful eyes of the people, LaSalle let out a steely harumph, pulled out the scroll again and began reciting its contents. All subjects of Extet, from His Majesty Nuvan to the 9 archdukes, upon learning of the tragedy, while bearing horrific sorrow and despair, we used our utmost rationale as well as intellect, and unanimously deemed that Constellation must be held accountable for Prince Maria Charlton's misfortune. Finishing this statement, LaSalle looked up and glanced at the whole hall once over. It is fair. It is Constellation's shame that the dignified Prince Maria met with such misfortune in this country. LaSalle narrowed his cold eyes a little, then lowered his head to continue reciting from the scroll. Number 1, to appease the deceased, Constellation must arrange to return the remains of our diplomatic group, especially that of Prince Maria, in the most dignified, respectable, and glorious manner. Number 2, to uphold justice, Constellation must provide assistance in our investigation and surrender the murderer, including the mastermind behind this. Fakin has let out a light snort and grumbled to Duke Cullen, who was by his side, assist them? My god, this sounds more like a superior giving orders to his subordinate. However, being laden with anxiety, the latter only stared at LaSalle with a solemn gaze. Extet's emergency diplomat's recital still went on. Number 3, to restore honor, we would like King Kessel to personally extend a public apology to the entire Extet. Thales lifted his brows. Gilbert's statement reappeared in his mind. It does not matter whether we fight or choose to form an armistice, His Majesty will not be able to escape from being criticized as a cold-hearted and ruthless king who disregards his people, oppresses the weak, and embarrasses Constellation. This will greatly impact His Majesty and Jadestar family's reputation and influence in the kingdom. But LaSalle was still delivering his blunt and ruthless speech. Number 4, to compensate for damage or loss, whether it be lands or resources, we expect to be reasonably and adequately compensated. Specifically, Extet expects compensations in the forms of 1. The 2 northern prefectures, which are adjacent to our kingdom, and land the size of which shall be not less than that of the Pine Nut County, or 2. A third of the preferential quota of the premium eternal oil from the eastern seacoast of the whale hunting industry in Constellation, or 2. 2/10 of the preferential quota of the crystal drop or mine at the southern coast territory of Constellation. Any one of the 3. Number 5, to uphold equality, the Fortress Treaty needs to be revised by both Constellation and Extet, especially the nonsensical boundary lines drawn 12 years ago. Pine Nut County, Charlatan County, Lever County, Bear County and Deer Cry County must be unconditionally returned to Extet's rule. The Duke of Watch City will withdraw his land cultivation team from the northern pine forest, and the number of hunters as well as herdsmen allowed into the pine forest annually can only be decided after consultation with the Archduke of Black Sand. The Duke of Lonely Old Tower shall have his patrol guards pulled backwards by 3 kilometers. They shall not unreasonably deny extensions from entering the public hunting zone. The hall was so quiet that even the sound of a needle dropping could be heard. But Thales knew that this was only on the surface. LaSalle slowly put the scroll down. As mentioned above, these are the conditions stipulated by King Nuvan and by Exdet. Suddenly, the dreadful silence in the hall was broken. What crap are you talking about? Unable to take it any longer, Count Zamunto shouted, Watch City will not retreat even one step. What is more, we will definitely not surrender Pine Nut County and Bear County. Go and tell that bastard in the Black Sand region, if he wants our land, he will have to come and get it with his troops. Count Freese also spoke coldly, Deer Cry County shall also remain the same. Besides, Lonely Old Tower will patrol wherever he wishes. Nevertheless, the Duke of the Northern Territory, who had the most authority to speak, chose to maintain silent. He gazed attentively at King Kessel V. The people in the hall turned their sights towards the Supreme King with varying expressions. Kessel stared upon the steps under his feet, as if what had happened was rather trivial, and spoke with a calm face, Nuvan, oh Nuvan, Exdet is definitely too voracious to think that it could make use of the dead prince in exchange for our 7 counties. Not taking this insult lying down, LaSalle lifted his head and stared straight at Kessel. The damage to Exdet is not the loss of a prince per se, it is also damage done to our honor and dignity. Our diplomatic group came here in goodwill, but was shoddily treated. Who then will vindicate the humiliation Exdet has suffered? Who is going to tame the great dragon's flames of fury? What is more, Constellation, what you all took away was the only son to a father. LaSalle continued with utmost fury. The sole legitimate and true heir to the throne, who had come with a mission for friendship and peace, but died due to a despicable assassination. King Nuvan lost his kin, his only son, his sole heir. Exdet lost the next Archduke of Dragoncloud City, the future of the Walton family. In the end, LaSalle roared. Even with such a devastating blow, King Nuvan did not send an army but only put up some conditions. Is this not the most rational and restrained choice? The hall was then filled with inhales of discontentment among the nobles. Kessel maintained his calm tone, yet with a voice that allowed no argument, he said, the first 3 conditions can be fulfilled, but the 4th and 5th. The king's voice rang coldly across the hall. Constellation will never allow me to cut off our land, or prepare to surrender the quota of our resources. If we say that, what are you going to do? Val began to frown. Duke Cullen sighed deeply, while Faken has let out an unpleasant bark of laughter. Lyanna and Zayan pursed their lips tight and kept absolutely quiet. Thales lowered his heart in agony. Can war not be prevented? Ha ha ha, King Kessel. LaSalle laughed in extreme anger. When we came to Eternal Star in the past, King 80 similarly rejected the requests we brought forth on behalf of King Nuvan and the 9 archdukes. What happened after that? LaSalle spread his arms wide open and again peered around the hall. Many of the older suzerains, nobles and officials tensed up. Yes, we generously dispatched our army. With accelerated breathing and an even more icy facial expression, LaSalle continued, whatever that rightfully belongs to him, the great dragon will come and get it himself. Everyone in the conference hall began to ponder the consequences of this statement. 12 years ago, the chaos and disaster of war involving most of Constellation remained vivid in their minds. When righteousness cannot be upheld, and justice turns to dust. LaSalle raised his right hand in an oppressive manner and slowly clenched his fist. Then Exdet will have no choice but to use war to safeguard our honor and His Majesty's dignity. He threatened. By then, the problem will not be easily resolved with a few counties or some eternal oil. Enough. Kessel replied in a seemingly profound manner. Is there no other method to properly resolve the grievance between Constellation and the Great Dragon in your eyes and King Nuvan's? Do you really wish to witness bloodshed between the subjects of the 2 countries' borders? LaSalle responded quickly. Your Majesty, war or peace, it is all up to you. To tolerate humiliation for the sake of your subjects, or go to war at all costs? He swept his icy gaze across the ministers, particularly Count Zamunto, then laughed sarcastically. Especially when your northern territory does not even have sufficient military strength to defend Broken Dragon Fortress from the Black Sand Archduke's army? The Duke of the Northern Territory clenched his fist tightly. Gilbert whispered into Thales' ear with a sigh, during the bloody year, the Northern Territory was dealt a great blow when faced with the powerful vanguards of Exdet, second only to the damage suffered by Blade Edge Hill in the southwest. There was a time when widows outnumbered children in the Northern Territory. You are asking me to make a decision when faced with such a difficult choice? Kessel let out a cold harumph. You might as well just get Constellation a new king. Your Majesty, you are the Supreme King of Constellation. You are destined to shoulder this responsibility. LaSalle raised his head with a smile. If you cannot do it, then as you have said, you might as well choose a more capable individual to be the leader of Constellation from this hall full of nobles. Exdet will be more than happy to see this done. The entire conference hall rose into a commotion within an instant. Some even cursed aloud. Nonetheless, Exdet's emergency envoy was not done with his talking. LaSalle continued sinisterly, in any case, the next king of Constellation is also destined to not be from Jadestar, is he not? Many of the nobles looked at Kessel oddly, but even more looked to Thales. Was this envoy still ignorant about the national conference? Suddenly, Thales understood something. As expected, the assassination of the diplomatic group, the pressure by the suzerains to abdicate the throne, the arrival of the Great Dragon's diplomat, all these are intertwined. This would have been a meticulous scheme, if not for my appearance. Just as Gilbert had speculated, there are people from both sides of Constellation and Exdet working together, conspiring to wrest the ownership of the throne of Constellation from the Iron Hand King. But why did Kessel, his father, lead the subject of conversation to this particular point? The words that traveled into his ear made Thales' heart jump in fright. In the hall filled with astounded individuals, Kessel lifted his head and gazed at LaSalle. In that case, Extet, or rather the nobles of Extet would be more in favor of a certain constellation noble to be Constellation's supreme king? Allow me to speak the truth. LaSalle laughed contemptuously. There is none present here that meets our expectation. Extensions only admire heroes of war, even if they are our enemies. Is there anyone among you who fulfills this requirement? Kessel sighed, though no one knew why he did so. Of course, my vassals are either too far away or unwilling to launch their troops. Then, the only people who would qualify are those who must fight for their own territory, am I right? The hall suddenly turned silent upon the king's peculiar statement. LaSalle sensed that something was astray. He looked to a person, gradually showing doubts on his face. Something is wrong. King Kessel, he is. Just when everyone was puzzled about the present situation, the plump Duke Cullen seemed to have realized something else. He exhaled deeply, and also looked towards the same person. His face showed extreme agony. From Thales' amazed expression, Gilbert suddenly realized what was going on. After a brief sigh, he gritted his teeth and lowered his head to let loose a sigh. Under the entire hall's bewilderment and surprise, King Kessel took a deep breath, closed his eyes and said, "So, that is how it is." The king whispered, from collaborating with Extet's ambitious individuals to provoking conflict through a diplomat assassination plot. To personally declare to me the feasibility of war and propose to issue the final general edict. Then, to incite the suzerains, who have been eagerly waiting for a chance to pressure me into naming the heir, causing us to be embroiled in internal confrontation while you watch by the sides. And finally to this Extet envoy, who forced me into a dilemma, which could cost me dearly. In the end, you will successfully instigate war, and you would be able to easily gain recognition in the battlefield after conspiring with Extet, and ultimately abdicate me. To achieve your motive, you would not hesitate to sacrifice your land, your people, and even your country. Is that not so, traitor? Each of the Supreme King's words were more startling than the last. Thales also began breathing more quickly in the process of listening to his speech. Suddenly, the Iron Hand King, Kessel V, opened his eyes. He looked towards a corner of the hall with a desolate gaze, at an individual who had kept quiet for a long while. At this juncture, the king's eyes were filled with misery and anguish. So, it is you. He spoke slowly. Mastermind of all plots and schemes. The king's low and muddled voice uttered a name, which was previously unimaginable by anyone. Val Arundi. Chapter 70, Creator of Bad Precedents, 2. The conference hall was in a state of full commotion. Even LaSalle was frowning. This time around, other than Duke Cullen and Gilbert, all the nobles cast amazed looks upon the Duke of the Northern Territory, who had been keeping absolutely quiet until now. What was this about? Your Majesty? Duke Arundi? Being one of the suzerains of the Northern Territory too, Count Zamunto was puzzled and looked at the Duke of the Northern Territory as well as the king with an uncertain gaze. Whereas the disbelieving Count Fries simply stared blankly at Val. The commotion and uproar lasted well over 10 seconds until the suzerain of Cold Castle, Guardian Duke of the Northern Territory, the firm and resolute-looking Val Arundi lifted his head and turned around to look at the king. He no longer remained silent, but chose to let out a long sigh. Under the gazes of all the amazed onlookers, including that of Baron LaSalle, Val, the master of the White Eagle family, the man who was like a determined warrior, lifted his head and smiled. You are as sharp as ever, Kell. Lowering his head a little, the Duke of the Northern Territory sighed. Just like your damn elder brother. Thales' eyes were wide with shock. What? This prompted immediate reactions from all the people. Judging from the Duke of Northern Territory's reaction, my god. But how can this be? Kessel lowered his head and truly sighed. Are you not going to provide some explanations for us, Val? The king asked blandly. What is there to explain? It failed, did it not? Unperturbed and not in the least concerned about the other suzerain's gazes on him, Val continued, and you, when did you actually see through this? It was obvious that the slaying of the diplomat group was done by the other suzerains, was it not? I have appeared very innocent, and both the Northern Territory as well as the royal family were clearly victims of this scheme. Zayan stared at Val in disbelief. That is right. It is impossible. The assassination of the diplomat group was done by the united efforts of the nobles in New Star. Moreover, the Duke of the Northern Territory was not even in our group. With a lowered gaze, Kessel spoke in a soft voice. During the national conference yesterday, you were in too much of a hurry to cast your vote against Thales during the voting process of the higher parliament conference. The king's voice was filled with complex emotions. That was when I became suspicious of you. You should know that even when Koshtar offered to provide military support to help you as a bargaining chip for your vote, I would definitely not just sit back and watch the Northern Territory fall to ruin. There should not be any reason for you to object to my son as the successor just based on the One-Eyed Dragon's promise. The One-Eyed Dragon, Duke Koshtar, looked at the Duke of the Northern Territory in amazement. At the same time, he remembered the voting held during the afternoon of the previous day. Is that so? Val put on a sad smile. How do you know that I have no reason? You know I hate you very much, do you not? I should be the person you detest because of Lycia. King Kessel spoke with an expressionless face, but underneath his sleeves, his fists trembled slightly, though it went unnoticed by all. You are a noble man, you would not take it out on my son. At this point, most people turned to look at Thales, especially Count LaSalle, who had a face as dark as thunderclouds. Unless you have a special reason that makes it absolutely necessary for you to stop my son from being the heir. The king continued in a low voice. Under all the complicated gazes in the hall, Val sighed. But this is merely a guess. Perhaps this is only a coincidence. The king lifted his head and spoke with a detached voice. That is why I tested the diplomat of Extet today. Val smiled coldly. Certainly, after the bloody year, you have become very skeptical. Ignoring what he said, the king carried on. Lionel was able to find out that he was a subordinate of Archduke Lampard with just a couple of words. Only Lampard's subordinates would be so anxious to change the topic of conversation so as not to expose Archduke Lampard's evil ambition. Without saying a word, the Duchess of Blade Edge Hill looked at the Duke of the Northern Territory coldly. When he first got here, he put up an act with you. He looked as if he was a diplomat who did not know much about the Northern Territory's military strength, and he was trying to gauge the defensive abilities of Constellation's Northern Territory. You counterattacked without backing down. By the looks of it, he was trying to stir up a confrontational atmosphere, according to what was planned, Kessel V continued with a somber voice. But when I deliberately refused to make a clear choice between war and conciliation, he was very clear in threatening me by saying that the Northern Territory does not even have sufficient military strength to defend Broken Dragon Fortress. At that instant, he showed that he was well versed about the Northern Territory. Do you not think that this is very contradictory? It was then that my suspicion intensified. LaSalle's face turned pale in an instant. The king lowered his head and he went on. Moreover, he was clearly more interested in agitating me, provoking me, and to some extent, he had more interest in replacing me as the king of Constellation than helping King Nuvan strive for better benefits for Extet. Is it not sufficient for Lampard to procure lands in the Northern Territory? Why was he still so interested in me and in replacing the Jade Star royal family? Evidently, he was collaborating with someone from Constellation, and my crown was the collaborator's aspiration. The question is, who is qualified to work together with Extet's powerful nobles and the Archduke of Black Sand? Who can he work with to be able to gain mutual benefits and obtain a win situation? I have pondered over this for a long time. I have considered Nanchester, Covender, Cullen, and even Faken has. Originally, the least likely person was you, Val. Because when war erupts, the Northern Territory would be the first to be affected. So, together, you and I will be the pitiful targets of their plot, the sacrifices. Faken has sharp voice rang in the air. Ha. Unless, of course, he volunteers to be a sacrifice. Kessel V looked at Valorundi with a gaze as piercing as blades. However, when I looked at it from another angle, what can Archduke Lampard gain? If King Nuvan's only son died in the Northern Territory, then the Walton family would be out of the race in the next King Selection Congress. Therefore, Lampard would be able to obtain the land in the Northern Territory and the death of an opponent in the Northern Territory. In Constellation, who would have the highest amount of power to ensure the occurrence of these two events simultaneously? With grief on his face, Kessel slowly lifted up his head. That would be you, Valorundi, the person who controls the Northern Territory, the Guardian Duke of the Northern Territory. But I still cannot believe it. I would rather believe that this is just a coincidence. The Duke of the Northern Territory replied, no. In truth, you believed it long before this. You simply used every single method in your disposal to verify your suspicion, did you not? The king let out a light snort and cast a profound look at Extet's emergency envoy. Before this, my men intercepted Count LaSalle and sent them directly to East City District with all the other suzerains knowing about this clearly. Up until this morning, the hidden sentries of the Secret Intelligence Department ensured their absolute seclusion from any constellatiate, and also made sure that they did not know about yesterday's national conference as well as the appearance of an heir. They are also ignorant of the fact that their collaborator in Constellation is already in a sorry plight. Take a guess, under this situation, how many batches of people have the hidden sentries of the National Secret Intelligence Department intercepted for wanting to liaise with Count LaSalle? Morat's hoarse voice replied, 3 batches, Your Majesty. These people had the skills of a military scout. Their mouths were tightly sealed, and they refused to reveal the true identity of their master. He laughed aloud. But what good does it serve? Only a few places in the country have scouts with this characteristic. Discovering the man behind them was as easy as breathing. Val sighed and said, they were my best scouts. The Supreme King said coldly, but I did not manage to figure out what exactly the agreement between you and Lampard is and how you would come to realize your plan. That was until this extension mentioned that extensions prefer heroes from the battlefield. Yes, once war breaks out, the most dazzling person on the battlefield would be the hero. Extet itself was built on that basis. Moreover, in the likelihood of a war, who other than the Duke of the Northern Territory could better use the excuse of fending for the country to engage in warfare? If the enemies were actually your collaborator, then it would be very much easier for you to claim your honor and glory from the battlefield. When war breaks out, your pledge to defend the Northern Territory will make you a hero who fought against Extet. You will also become the only person who can mediate with them. In the situation where there are no more descendants in the royal family, are you not naturally the best suited to be the next king? Val laughed coldly. Looking at Val with grief, the king continued, am I right? Traitor of the Northern Territory, the Guardian Duke of the Northern Territory? Is it really so important for you to be a king? So important that a person with an originally noble and pure personality like yours would betray your land, your people, and your country? Suddenly, the hall was immersed in absolute silence. Even LaSalle felt awkward and kept his silence. Valorundi stared at the floor blankly for a long time. Then he shut his eyes tightly. Ha ha. As he laughed in a desolate manner, he opened his eyes and spoke calmly. It was not supposed to be like this. With a dazed expression on his face, Val slowly continued, all of this was supposed to go according to my plan. The king narrowed his eyes. New Star is a group that was set up right after the Desert War 5 years ago by Constellation suzerains, aiming to fight against your increasingly pretentious power as the king. It did not matter whether it was Cullen or Nanchester, all of them came to me, and were all rejected. But I reckoned that it was a rare opportunity. I could realize my objective from the confrontation between the both of you. That was an unbelievably far-away objective. Val walked towards the center of the hall. I sat upon a distant spot, and sighed. Despite the risk, I went to Extet and met Lampard. You should have seen his face when I took off my hood. That night, we formed our alliance. I was responsible in provoking Zamunto and Fries, in provoking them to engage in the frequent conflicts at the borders with Extet. For this purpose, I spared no pains in giving up Pine Nut County to Zamunto. 2 of the counts from the 13 distinguished families of the Northern Territory became livid and frowned. Both looked towards the Duke, whom they had fought side by side with over the years. In Extet, Lampard began his operation. Making use of the border conflicts, he exaggerated the importance of revising the treaty pertaining to national boundaries and blew it up until it became a great mission. King Nuvan was convinced and decided to secretly dispatch his only son for the diplomatic mission so that he could enhance his experience and qualification to be better prepared for the throne. He was old, and old people always wanted to arrange for all things that would happen after their demise. I disclosed this information to New Star. Many of the ambitious ones in the group like Nanchester and Covendir were quick to realize that it was a good opportunity to whittle the power of the king. The only thing I did not tell them was that the only son, whom King Nuvan secretly sent, was in that diplomatic group. Thinking of it now, they would have been quite intimidated if they found out about this fact. It is too bad. To quote a Far Eastern proverb, once you ride on a tiger, you will not be able to get off. Duke Cullen shook his head, Zayan let out a cold harumph, while Koster gritted his teeth and glared at Val. The suzerains were under the impression that they were using Extet's indignation and accusation to whittle away the king's prestige and power. Only Lampard and I knew that they were just beginning to instigate a war between the two countries. Lampard was the source of information on Extet, providing me with information concerning the diplomatic group's travel route and personnel. I was tasked to buy over the escorts since I had the advantage of having control over the Northern Territory. I was to monitor and guide them to the ideal assassination sites, and the ignorant New Star would finish up the last part of the plot. The 3 sides unknowingly coordinated together to complete our mission. Even the skillful guards beside the prince were not able to escape death. Lampard speedily forwarded the news to the secret room, to Dragoncloud City, and at the same time, recommended LaSalle Weeder to the anguished King Nuvan. I rushed non-stop to bring the news to Eternal Star, suggesting military mobilization to exaggerate the seriousness of the matter, so as to make Kessel convene a meeting among the nobles to discuss it. This was to obtain majority support, and the more, the better. LaSalle looked at Val with a pale face, then turned to Kessel. No one took notice of him. Zayan Covendir, little boy, you should have been dead during yesterday's assassination. The nobles of New Star were not the only ones who knew about your whereabouts. I, the schemer, also knew. Immediately, Zayan's expression changed. Yes. Val Arundi nodded his head powerlessly. The one who tried to kill you was not one of your fellow New Star. It was me. Just look at your alliance, all of you started to harbor suspicions towards each other upon learning the news of the attempted assassination. That shows how fragile your alliance actually is. Several of the dukes and counts narrowed their eyes. Zayan slammed his palm fiercely on the armrest. The young Covendir spoke in anger. So yesterday, when that boy, you stood up for him to sow discord among the suzerains. Because you have planned this all along. Val had a disarming smile, and as Zayan still remained livid, he continued speaking, this way, New Star would soon become scattered as a result of doubt and internal instability. The royal family's pressure will be greatly enhanced, and I too would have one less strong opponent to deal with in the future. The original plan of New Star was to force the king to appoint an heir when he most needed their support for war, but in such a chaotic parliament where the members were highly skeptical of each other, this plan would definitely bring about a lot of problems in the future. Meanwhile, my proposal and Kessel's to fight against Extet's invasion would surely fail to get the support of the other suzerains. It would have seemed as if the both of us had been schemed against. And in a few hours, LaSalle Weeder would barge into Eternal Star with Extet's indignation. He would start to provoke us in a frenzy, and he would propose conditions that Constellation could not accept. There was only one aim, war. Thales looked at Val in great disbelief. If Kessel had chosen war, as per our plan, we would have made sure that he would not have sufficient military power. Then Lampard would easily succeed in the invasion of the Northern Territory, and my tacit agreement with Lampard could easily render Kessel's glorious death in the battlefield, just like what had happened to the late Prince Horace. At the very least, I would be able to let him taste the agony of defeat, or he would disheartened and disgraced. On the other hand, if Kessel had chosen conciliation, giving up the Northern Territory would make him a criminal in the kingdom. I would urge the suzerains and the citizens to abdicate him from his throne, but I would still remain in the Northern Territory and be involved in the battle. When Extet, particularly Lampard, comes to claim the territory, the suzerains and the royal family would cower, and only I would call upon the military and pledge to fight against the attackers to my death. It would make me even more noble, like the only beam of light in the dark. Ha! And someone called me a hypocrite before this. Upon hearing this, the one-eyed dragon glared at Thales. Arundi folded his arms and put on a pained smile. Yes, no matter which choice, we would meet a disastrous defeat in the Northern Territory. But then, in the darkest moment of all, I would suddenly defeat Lampard in a crucial battle, thereby reversing the situation. After that, Lampard and I would appreciate each other's abilities, and once we form an alliance, he would retreat with the territory he claimed, feeling satisfied. I would be a hero worthy of becoming the new king. Compared to Kessel, who has suffered tremendous blame and has no support from the suzerains, I would naturally be the best choice to be the next powerful king. Val Arundi. Count Zamunto shouted angrily, that is our northern territory. The land your ancestors defended and ruled for ages. Stop this nonsense. Count Fries looked at Val with a dark gaze. Can you not see? He is no longer the Iron Eagle Duke we used to know. With a desolate look, Val did not even notice the two counts from Northern Territory. He continued with a dazed expression. Among the mutual distrust of the suzerains, I should have been the least suspected person, since I remained neutral. Moreover, even if the king still survived by then, I am his closest friend, brother of the head ritual master of Sunset Temple, and the popular hero of Constellation, who will return after fending off an invasion. I am destined to be the next supreme king of Constellation. Whereas, in Extet, without a rightful heir to the throne, the Walton family would have to withdraw from the King's Selection Congress. At the same time, based on Lampard's splendid accomplishments in invading Constellation and the occupation of a large chunk of land in the Northern Territory, he would rapidly rise to power. With Constellation and my support, Lampard would be destined to be the next king of Extet. With a strange look on his face, Val Arundi gazed at Thales, and an expression that said he was sorry things turned out this way appeared across his eyes. Everything was supposed to go smoothly without a hitch, until the sudden appearance of this boy, which messed up the entire plan. Zayan is not dead, he is still on your side. The effect of forcing you to name the heir was not good. There was no life and death struggle among the suzerains of New Star as far as the issue of succession was concerned. Instead, they got into a conflict with the royal family in terms of the appointment of the new prince. The diplomat from Extet was caught in your trap by his ignorance of the National Conference and the appointment of a new prince. Nevertheless, I will have to go on walking until... Val sighed, smiled in a mocking manner, and shook his head indifferently. Just like that, I failed. At this point, the hall fell into total silence.